The rain had been falling for hours, as though the sky itself had turned its back on the small town below. Elena walked through the deserted streets, her coat damp, her footsteps echoing in the empty alleyways. It was one of those days when time felt stretched thin, the world slowed by the downpour. She hadn't intended to enter the small, dimly lit shop on the corner, but the place seemed to beckon her, its withered signs swinging gently in the wind. Tilda's curiosities it read in faded gold letters, the font barely legible against the peeling wood. She pushed open the door, which creaked as it swung inward, and stepped into the musty interior. The air inside was thick with the smell of old paper, dust, and incense. The walls were lined with shelves of mismatched objects, ancient books, tarnished silverware, porcelain dolls with cracked faces. Nothing about the place seemed inviting. In fact, it felt as though time had passed it by entirely. Elena stood at the threshold for a moment, unsure of why she had entered. Perhaps it was the weather, or maybe it was the curiosity that gnawed at her from the very first glance. She shook her head and wandered deeper into the store, each step producing a soft thud on the creaky wooden floor. The place was nearly empty of customers, the silence interrupted only by the occasional drip of water from the rain outside. She moved past the shelves, drawn by something, a flicker of light that caught her eye. It wasn't bright, not in the way one might expect, but it was there, nestled between rows of dust-covered books. It was small, delicate even, glowing faintly against the gloom of the shop. Elena's hand reached out, almost of its own accord. There, tucked in a forgotten corner, was a single candle. The wax was ivory and smooth, and its wick appeared untouched, as though it had never been lit. Yet, even in the dim light of the shop, Elena could see that the candle was subtly glowing, its soft warmth radiating like an ember from a dying fire. It looked out of place, too pristine among the other forgotten relics. Curiosity tugged at her, stronger than reason. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight in her palm. It was heavier than it should have been. Her fingers brushed the surface, and for the briefest moment, she felt a cold shiver run through her. It was fleeting, but unmistakable. That one? A voice from behind startled her. She turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, a frail figure with a wild mane of gray hair, eyes hidden behind thick glasses. The woman studied Elena intently. There was something strange in her gaze, as if she could see beyond Elena's face, beyond the surface of her thoughts. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," the woman said, her voice low and gravelly. "It's not like the others." Elena paused, holding the candle in midair. "Why? What's wrong with it?" she asked, her voice thick with skepticism. The woman took a slow step forward, her eyes narrowing. "That candle is special, and not in a good way. You see, it never goes out. No matter what you do. You can submerge it in water, bury it in the earth, and it will still burn. Forever. And once you light it, it's bound to you." Elena let out a soft laugh. "Come on, it's just a candle. What's the worst that could happen?" The woman's expression darkened, and she took a step closer. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Candles like that, things like that, have a way of creeping into your life when you least expect it. Don't say I didn't warn you." Elena hesitated, her fingers tightening around the candle's base. The woman's warning sounded more like a riddle than anything else, but there was a strange weight to her words. She looked down at the candle once more, its faint glow mesmerizing her. "I'll take it," Elena said, almost absent-mindedly, not truly understanding why she was making the decision. The woman didn't protest further. She simply nodded and turned, disappearing into the back of the shop. With the candle in hand, Elena left the shop. She didn't notice the small, furtive glance the shopkeeper cast at her as she exited. Nor did she feel the chill that swept through the air the moment the door closed behind her. Elena didn't think much of the candle until she returned to her apartment that evening. It was small, tucked away on the top floor of an aging building, and the only light that filtered through the windows was dim and filtered by the heavy rain clouds outside. The space was cozy in an unremarkable way: simple furniture, an overstuffed couch, a bookshelf full of novels. But there was something about the candle, sitting on her kitchen table, that drew her attention. It felt off, like an object that didn't belong in the space. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed it on the table. She studied it for a moment, staring at the subtle flickering light. It wasn't enough to illuminate the room in any meaningful way, but it was there, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Against her better judgment, she decided to light it. The match scratched across the box, the flame catching easily. The wick ignited in an instant, and for a moment, Elena just stared. The flame wasn't like a normal candle. It burned too brightly, too steadily, as if it had a will of its own. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the creeping feeling of unease rising in her chest. "It's just a candle," she whispered to herself. The night passed, and Elena fell asleep on the couch, the candle still burning beside her. The low, flickering light illuminated the room in a way that felt strange. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she could have sworn that the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and move, stretching unnaturally toward the flame. When Elena woke in the middle of the night, she was instantly aware of something wrong. Her apartment was colder than usual, and the faint glow of the candle was still burning. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 2:32 a.m. She had been asleep for hours. But the candle hadn't gone out. Her heartbeat quickened. She sat up, wiping the sleep from her eyes, and looked at the flame. It was as bright and steady as ever, casting long shadows across the walls. Without thinking, she grabbed the glass of water sitting on her nightstand and poured it over the candle. The flame didn't flicker. It didn't even budge. It kept burning, steady as ever, unaffected by the water. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer. Elena stared at the candle, feeling a cold dread creep into her bones. She tried again. She grabbed a towel and wrapped it around the candle's base, hoping that the cloth would smother the flame. She pressed it against the wick, waiting for it to die. Nothing. The candle's flame remained, mocking her. Elena's heart raced, panic setting in. She backed away from the table, her mind racing through possibilities. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't. But there it was. A candle that refused to die. She reached for her phone, her hand shaking as she tried to dial the number for the shop. But there was no response. The line was dead. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. And then, in the stillness of the room, Elena heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, too quiet to understand. But as the seconds passed, it became clearer. "Elena. Elena." her breath caught in her throat. The voice was soft, almost a murmur, but it was there, in the room with her. Elena. Her mind spun. She couldn't understand. Was she imagining it? Was it the candle? The voice continued, though soft, insistent. You shouldn't have lit it, Elena. Elena's breath quickened as she stared at the candle. The voice was gone now, replaced by an eerie stillness. But the air in the room had thickened, as though it had become heavier, pressing on her from all sides. The candle still burned, as steady as ever, its faint flicker casting long, warped shadows across the walls. The shadows seemed to move in a way that defied logic, stretching and twisting like dark fingers that reached out, crawling toward her. She swallowed, her throat dry, and took a cautious step back. She had to get rid of it. She had to. Elena reached down to grab the candle again, intending to throw it out the window, to rid herself of whatever curse had found its way into her life. But the moment her fingers brushed the smooth surface of the wax, a sharp, icy sensation shot through her hand. It was as if the candle was cold to the touch, yet, at the same time, it felt wrong. It didn't belong to her. It didn't belong in this world. Get out of my head, Elena whispered to herself, her mind racing. Was she losing her sanity? Could it really be possible that a simple candle had somehow become the source of her growing terror? The whispers returned, more insistent now. You can't run from me, Elena. The voice was chilling, distant, yet unmistakable. It seemed to rise from the very walls of her apartment, from the shadows themselves. She jerked her hand away from the candle, her pulse pounding in her ears. She ran to the window, yanked it open, and tossed the candle into the street below, the flickering light visible for a brief moment before it disappeared into the night. The room felt lighter. The weight of the atmosphere lifted, and Elena allowed herself to take a deep breath, relieved even though her hands were still trembling. She had done it. She had rid herself of the cursed thing. Or so she thought. The candle was back on the table when she turned around. Elena stood frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest. The candle had returned, as though it had never left. The flame was still burning, unyielding, undeterred. She had seen it fall to the ground. She had heard the faint thud of it hitting the pavement below. She had watched it disappear into the night. But now it sat there, mocking her. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. No, this isn't real, she muttered to herself, pacing back and forth. It's just a damn candle. It's nothing. The words fell hollow in the room. It was something. She had seen it, felt it. This wasn't a trick of the mind. The candle was alive, in a way. Alive in a way that shouldn't be possible. A noise startled her from her thoughts, a low, grating sound, like the scraping of nails against wood. Elena spun around, her eyes darting to the walls, to the corners of the room. She was being watched. She could feel it. The whispers came again, softer this time, almost coaxing, as though the entity behind them were trying to lull her into some kind of trance. You shouldn't have thrown me away. Her throat constricted. She couldn't breathe. The air was suffocating. The shadows in the corners were no longer just shadows. They seemed to take form, coiling like smoke, swirling with a life of their own. She could see them shift, elongating, twisting as though they were searching for something, her. And then, she saw it. The candle, glowing more brightly than ever, was beginning to drip. The wax melted at an unnatural pace, cascading down the sides of the candle in thick streams, but the flame didn't flicker. It burned without fail, without mercy. The wax pooled around its base, forming strange shapes, symbols she couldn't quite make out. Her mind was racing, thoughts colliding in a frenzy. Why won't it go out? Why was this happening to her? She thought of the strange woman in the shop, Tilda. What had she said? Once you light it, it's bound to you. Bound. Elena's stomach turned. Her mind began to connect the dots, but even as the realization struck, she found herself unwilling to accept it. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But it was. The candle had become part of her life, a permanent fixture that refused to die. And the longer it burned, the more she felt it. The connection. The pull. Elena collapsed onto the couch, shaking. Her hands trembled as they reached for her phone again. She needed help. She needed to get answers, to find someone who could explain this madness. She dialed the number for her closest friend, Melissa, but there was no answer. She tried again, no answer. In a desperate panic, Elena searched online for any mention of a candle like the one in her apartment. But there was nothing. No warnings. No explanations. No one had ever experienced anything like this. She looked over at the table again, her heart dropping into her stomach. The candle was still there, its flame dancing in the darkness. The wax had dripped onto the table, pooling into strange shapes, grotesque and unnatural. But it wasn't just the candle that unnerved her. It was the way the room felt. The silence. The stillness. She could feel it pressing in from all sides, like an invisible force suffocating her, trapping her. The shadows, once harmless, had begun to take on more menacing presence. They crept closer, inch by inch, until they were almost at her feet. Elena. The whisper came again, the voice more guttural now, its presence behind her, its breath cold on the back of her neck. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Only the shadows. The whispers weren't just in her mind anymore. They were in the air, vibrating the walls, filling her apartment with their dread. And then, she saw it again, the shape in the shadows, creeping just out of the corner of her eye. It wasn't human. She wasn't sure what it was. It was something, a twisting, writhing thing that shifted too quickly for her to grasp. Every time she blinked, it was closer. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. The candle was still glowing. The flame, steady, unyielding. No matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, it would never go out. In a panic, Elena rushed to the door, her fingers fumbling as she tried to turn the handle. But the door wouldn't open. She tugged again, harder this time. No. It was stuck. It felt wrong. Like something was holding it closed from the other side. The handle refused to turn, the lock somehow engaged. Her pulse quickened, and her breath came in short, ragged bursts. She pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. The apartment felt sealed off from the outside world, as though it were a prison, a cage. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Elena whispered, falling to her knees. "What do you want from me?" There was no answer, not from the candle, not from the shadows. Only silence. Thick, suffocating silence. And yet, Elena could feel it. The weight of something unseen, pressing in, suffocating her. She backed away from the door, slowly, her eyes fixed on the candle. The flame was brighter now, burning with an intensity that made the entire room shimmer. The shadows seemed to thicken and grow in response, the air growing heavier still. As Elena sank to the floor, clutching her chest, she couldn't help but wonder if she had crossed a line, if she had awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed. She closed her eyes, hoping for a moment of peace. But when she opened them again, the candle was gone. The table was bare. For a split second, Elena felt a glimmer of hope. But then, the whispers returned. Faint, unyielding. "You can't escape." Elena's heart raced as the apartment felt darker, colder, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners were no longer just empty spaces that seemed to pulse with an unseen life. She had been staring at the empty table for what felt like hours. The candle had vanished, or so she thought, but a quiet, insidious dread clung to her like a second skin. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing on her. The air was thick, suffocating. She couldn't explain what was happening. Her mind, once sharp and clear, now felt foggy, disjointed. What was real? What was she imagining? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to calm her thoughts, but they wouldn't stop spinning. The whispers, those cursed whispers, were growing louder, almost like a rhythmic chant, distant yet distinct. "You can't escape me, Elena." The voice slithered into her brain like a parasite, wrapping its tendrils around her thoughts. Her fingers trembled as she rubbed at her temples, trying to stave off the headache that was growing stronger with each passing minute. But the whispering didn't stop. "I am here. I am always here." She opened her eyes, hoping to focus on something, anything that might anchor her to reality, but everything was distorted. The shadows in the corners seemed to twist and shift, becoming more pronounced, more tangible. Her vision blurred, and she staggered to the window, hoping for a breath of fresh air to clear her mind. She threw it open, inhaling the cool night air. But something was wrong. There was no sound outside. No wind. No cars. No movement. The street below her was empty. Her stomach twisted with unease. How long had she been trapped in here? She couldn't tell. Time had become a blur, a mess of confusion and fear. Elena turned back into the apartment, her legs unsteady. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting from the empty table to the dark corners. Her breath caught in her throat. The candle was back. It wasn't just the candle that had returned. It was everything. The light, the heat, it was all too much. The room felt too small, too close, like something was suffocating her. The flame flickered, dancing wildly as if it had a life of its own. It cast strange, elongated shadows that stretched across the walls, twisting in unnatural ways. But what struck her the most wasn't the candle itself, it was the feeling. The same feeling from before. The sensation that something was watching her. Something lurking just behind her, waiting. She swallowed hard, moving closer to the table. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it, the wax had begun to change. The familiar, smooth surface of the candle was now coated in deep, dark cracks, like something ancient and cursed was seeping from inside it. The flame grew hotter, brighter, more intense. And yet, no matter how the wax melted, the flame never died. Elena. The voice was clearer now, a low rasp that slithered beneath her skin. It felt like fingers were caressing the back of her neck, urging her to listen, to understand. Her mind felt stretched thin, as though she were being pulled in every direction at once. She could hardly think straight. Panic gripped her, and her hands shook as she backed away from the candle, her legs weak beneath her. She had to get away. She had to escape. But every step she took, the shadows followed, creeping on her, filling the corners of the room. The air became heavier, almost suffocating, like an invisible weight was pressing down on her chest. She could barely breathe. "You are mine now, Elena." The voice was stronger, more insistent. Elena gripped her head, her mind splintering. What was this? What had she done to deserve this nightmare? Her thoughts spiraled. The woman at the store, Tilda, had she known? Had she expected this? But no! She had warned her. She had given Elena a choice. Hadn't she? Her vision flickered, and in the space between one blink and the next, the shadows in the room took on a new form. A figure, tall, thin, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, stood in the corner, staring at her. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong. It was as though the shadows themselves had taken on flesh and manifested into something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Her breath caught in her throat. .3.3, the weight of the candle. Elena stumbled backward, her hands fumbling for the door again. She had to get out. She had to leave this place. But the door wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't turn. Panic surged through her body, and she threw herself against it, desperate to escape. But the door remained stubbornly closed. The candle burned brighter. Its flame pulsed like a heartbeat, growing more erratic. The shadows seemed to shift with it, moving as though they had minds of their own, as though they were closing in on her. A low growl echoed from the back of the room, deep and guttural. The shadows seemed to take shape, each twisting into something darker, more malignant. The whispering became louder, more frenetic, drowning out her thoughts. The walls around her seemed to close in, the air growing heavier, thicker. She could feel the weight of the candle now. Not just the physical weight, but the burden it carried. It was as though the flame had a consciousness of its own, an awareness that was seeking her out, calling her to it. The room spun, and she staggered back, her mind on the brink of breaking. "You have to feed me, Elena. You have to keep me alive." The words sank deep into her skull, digging into her mind, filling every inch of her being with dread. She could feel it now, the urge, a sickening pull toward the candle, toward the flame. She couldn't escape it. She could feel the darkness taking root inside her, spreading like poison. The candle wasn't just an object, it was a presence, a thing that had attached itself to her soul. And no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she resisted, it would never let her go. Elena collapsed to her knees, clutching her head, her body racked with sobs. The shadows closed in tighter, the whispers louder, until they were deafening. The candle flickered. And in that brief moment, Elena understood. It wasn't just a curse. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something worse. The candle was feeding on her. The longer it burned, the more it consumed. It wasn't just the wax or the flame, it was her. Her mind. Her soul. The darkness was inside her now. Elena's breath hitched. The last vestiges of her sanity began to crumble as she reached out, trembling, toward the candle. The moment her fingers brushed against the wax, an overwhelming rush of cold fear coursed through her veins. The flame flickered, a brief pulse of warmth, before it flared back to life with an intensity that felt alive. She was bound to it. Forever. The candle would never go out. Elena's mind fractured. The moment her fingers brushed the candle's wax, she felt it, the bond. It wasn't a physical connection, not something she could hold in her hand or see with her eyes, but it was there, unmistakable and consuming. The candle wasn't just some object. It was a part of her now, and it had been since the first moment she lit it. The heat from the flame seared her skin, and she yanked her hand back in pain, but it wasn't just her skin that burned. The fire inside her mind flared, deep and unrelenting, consuming her thoughts, her memories, her very soul. The shadows around her darkened, thickening, as if they could feel her unraveling. "You belong to me now." The voice, deep and suffocating, echoed in her mind. It wasn't just the candle anymore, it was everything. The shadows, the air, the weight of the room, it all pulsed with the same dark rhythm. And Elena could feel it, could feel her own mind slipping further away, like a ship being pulled into an endless, bottomless sea. She tried to breathe, but the air was thick, suffocating. She needed to fight back, to scream, to break free. But the whispers filled her head, louder than before. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was hundreds, thousands, an endless chorus of malicious, guttural sounds. "You can't escape. You'll never be free. You will feed me, Elena." Tears welled in her eyes as she fell to her knees, gripping the floor with shaking hands. She had tried everything. She had thrown the candle away, but it came back. She had tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. Every escape she had attempted had only led her deeper into the trap. The flames of the candle flickered again, dancing with a life of their own. The wax pooled, dripping down the sides in long, grotesque streams. The shadows pressed in from all directions, their edges growing sharper, more defined, like they had substance. And then, Elena understood. She wasn't just trapped in the apartment. She wasn't just bound to the candle. She was the candle. The flame that had never gone out was a reflection of her own soul, a soul that had been consumed, that had been bound to the curse of the candle the moment she had lit it. The fire that burned inside her was as much a part of her as her heartbeat. Elena's body trembled violently as the realization sank in. The shadows closed in tighter, wrapping around her like an inescapable cocoon. Her skin felt hot, as though it were melting, stretching, warping with the burning heat that pulsed inside her. The flame flickered again, its light casting the entire room into chaotic movement. The walls seemed to bend and sway as though they were alive, watching her, waiting. She felt it first in her hands. A sudden surge of heat, so intense it made her cry out. Her fingers clenched involuntarily, her nails digging into her palms as the wax began to ooze from her skin, not in liquid form, but as a strange, solid substance that moved, slithering beneath her skin, writhing, twisting like something alive. Her mouth went dry. She gasped, trying to scream, but no sound came. Her throat constricted, the air thickening as though she were choking on smoke. She clawed at her face, at her body, as though trying to tear herself free of the grip of whatever had taken hold of her. But it was no use. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, and Elena froze. The person staring back at her wasn't her anymore. Her skin had darkened, a dull grayish hue taking over her features, and her eyes, her once bright, clear eyes, were now black, entirely void of light, like the very shadows themselves had consumed them. The flame inside the candle danced in the reflection, but it was no longer just in the candle. It was inside her, in her heart, in her soul, in every part of her. She gasped again, and the flame flickered once more, just as it had every time it felt close to dying. She could feel it, feel herself feeding the flame, keeping it alive. A grotesque laugh bubbled up from her throat, not her own, but the voice that had been whispering to her all this time. Yes. Feed me, Elena. You will always feed me. Her body no longer felt like her own. It felt foreign, monstrous. As the candle's flame burned brighter, its light started to merge with her own, consuming everything she was. She could feel her thoughts slipping away. The desire to fight, to resist, had faded. The hunger, the pull of the flame, was all that remained. Outside, the world was silent. The city was gone, the people were gone. The apartment had become a prison of her own making, a place where time no longer existed, and the only thing that remained was the unyielding heat of the flame and the shadows that danced with it. The shadowy figures in the corners of the room began to stir, emerging from the walls, the floor, the air itself. They were alive now, tangible, real. They crept closer to Elena, their forms shifting and changing, their faces blurred, but their eyes, those eyes, were as dark as hers, empty, void of light. They came for her, reaching out with long, twisted fingers. She didn't move. She couldn't move. Join us, Elena. The voice was no longer just in her mind. It was in the room with her, surrounding her, filling every corner with its dark presence. She could feel herself being pulled toward it, drawn into the shadows. The whispers, the voices, they were all her now. Part of her. The flame. The shadows. She had become one with them. She was no longer human. She was the candle. The flame that never went out. Time no longer had meaning. The outside world no longer mattered. The apartment had ceased to exist in the way it once had. All that remained was the candle, the flame, and the darkness that surrounded it. Elena could feel the pull of the flame, the call to feed it. She could feel the endless hunger, the need to sustain it, to keep it alive. She was bound to it, trapped in an endless loop, feeding it for all eternity. Her body, once fragile and human, was now something else. Something unrecognizable, forged by the flame, made to burn forever. The candle had claimed her, just as it had claimed countless others before her. And the candle would never go out. The flame would burn for eternity. Story 2. Grace Harlow had always loved antiques. There was something about them, something that made her feel connected to the past, to the lives that had been lived in the old houses, and the stories they carried. So when she inherited her late aunt's house, filled with relics of the past, she was more than happy to keep the pieces. The house itself was a small, charming cottage just outside of town, nestled under the dark, twisted limbs of a row of ancient oak trees. The kind of house where the shadows were deep and the air seemed thick with history. Among the inherited items was a rocking chair, a heavy, dark wood piece that sat, almost proudly, in the living room. Grace had always had an affection for rocking chairs, especially the antique ones, but this one was different. She didn't know why, but the chair seemed to demand attention. She couldn't quite explain it. There was something about it that felt out of place in the otherwise cozy living room. The chair had been tucked away in the far corner, covered in a dusty cloth when she first saw it. It seemed to be the only thing in the house that didn't fit with the rest of the decor, too dark, too imposing. The moment Grace uncovered it, she felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone, or something, was watching her. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to the weight of the house, the memories of her late aunt pressing down on her. It was the kind of feeling one gets when they find an old photograph, or relic of someone they never knew, but who still feels important. But this chair, this rocking chair, was different. Its smooth, warm wooden arms were like something from a forgotten dream, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the fabric, but beneath that, something darker lingered, something almost alive. With a sigh, Grace decided to place it by the fireplace, thinking it might be a charming piece to bring life into the space. What harm could it do, after all? She couldn't shake the feeling that the chair was waiting for something, but she dismissed it as foolish superstition. That evening, after a long day of sorting through her aunt's belongings, Grace sank into the chair for a moment of rest. As she settled into its familiar embrace, the floorboards creaked beneath her, and the old chair groaned. A soft breeze stirred the curtains, sending them swaying gently. But just as Grace let out a sigh of relief, a noise sliced through the calm, a soft, low moan. At first, Grace thought it was just the house settling, an old building, full of creaks and groans. But as she closed her eyes, trying to push the noise from her mind, the sound came again. It was a deep, hollow moan, like the sound of someone in pain. Her heart quickened, and she shot up from the chair, her breath catching in her throat. The house was quiet again. She stood frozen, her pulse drumming in her ears, scanning the room, but there was no sign of movement. The chair sat there, motionless, as if nothing had happened. But the air felt heavier now, laden with something she couldn't quite define, something that was waiting. Grace shook her head. "It's just the house," she muttered to herself, taking a few steps back. She turned off the lights and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The chair lingered in her thoughts, its presence hanging in the air like a dark cloud. The next day, Grace went about her usual routine. She took a walk into town to grab a few essentials and returned later in the afternoon, feeling a little lighter. The house was quiet, and the weight from the previous night seemed to have dissipated. But as she stepped into the living room, her stomach dropped. The chair was rocking, slowly, back and forth. Grace froze in the doorway. Her breath hitched. The chair moved. No one was near it. There was no wind, no draft. It was impossible. She hadn't touched it, and yet it rocked with a slow, rhythmic motion, creaking softly with each back and forth sway. She stepped into the room, her footsteps hesitant. The air felt heavy, as if charged with electricity. She stood there, staring at the chair, willing herself to approach it, to touch it, to prove that it was just her imagination. But then, just as she reached out to stop it, it happened. A scream. A raw, gut-wrenching scream, so human, so filled with anguish, it sliced through her like a blade. It came from the chair, from the depths of it, and as the sound echoed in the room, Grace stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. She clutched the doorframe for support, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. The scream echoed in her mind, ringing in her ears. It was as if the sound had lodged itself inside her head, refusing to leave, twisting her thoughts into something jagged and wrong. The chair ceased its movement, settling back into stillness. Grace stood frozen, breathless, unable to move, unable to speak. She looked at the chair, its wooden frame now silent, no trace of what had just occurred remaining. Had she imagined it? Had it been a trick of the mind? Her thoughts spun in circles. But she knew what she had heard. She knew. That scream hadn't come from her, hadn't come from anywhere except the chair. She had felt it, deep in her bones. Grace's nerves were on edge as she paced the living room, running her fingers through her hair. What was happening? Was the chair haunted? Had someone, perhaps, died in it? The house was old. It had a history, sure, but screaming? That didn't make sense. Her rational mind told her it was a trick, some old mechanism that had been hidden deep within the chair, but the scream had felt too real, too visceral. It wasn't just a sound, it was an experience, one that rattled her to her core. Determined to find an explanation, Grace set out to research the chair. She visited the town's local library, digging through old newspapers and records, hoping to find a clue. As she flipped through page after page of faded ink and yellowing paper, she came across an article. It was about the Harrison estate, a long-abandoned mansion in the area. The estate had been known for its collection of rare antiques, including a rocking chair, the very rocking chair she now owned. The article detailed strange happenings at the estate, including mysterious disappearances and strange sounds that seemed to emanate from nowhere. It was said that the chair had once belonged to a woman named Margaret Harrison, whose tragic death was rumored to have been caused by something unnatural. Grace's skin prickled as she read the words. She returned home, her mind spinning, her pulse quickening. Was the chair somehow connected to this woman? To the house that had once held it? The piece of history she had inherited was more than just an antique. It was a doorway, and something wanted her to open it. Underscore 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 underscore. End of chapter 1. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something much darker than she had anticipated. The discovery of the Harrison Estates article had opened a door to questions she hadn't even thought to ask. What had happened to Margaret Harrison? Was the chair truly connected to her death, or was this all just a collection of eerie coincidences? That evening, Grace sat in front of her computer, scouring the internet for any additional information she could find about the Harrison family. She knew the basics. Margaret Harrison had died under mysterious circumstances, and her family's wealth had been tied to rare, valuable antiques. But the more she searched, the more the answers seemed to slip through her fingers. One article she found mentioned a letter that had been found shortly after Margaret's death, addressed to the local authorities. In it, she spoke of strange happenings in the house, the constant sound of footsteps when no one was there, the smell of burning wax when no candles were lit, and the feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. The letter's last lines were cryptic, almost frantic. The chair. It calls to me. It will not stop until it is heard. Grace's hands trembled as she read the words. She scrolled down, desperate to learn more. But there were no follow-up articles, no investigations. It was as if Margaret had simply vanished, and so had any trace of her strange words. She closed her laptop and stood, pacing the living room. The chair, now pushed against the wall, seemed to stare back at her, waiting, almost as if it knew she was trying to uncover its secrets. Grace had been hoping for some logical explanation, but now she was certain of one thing: this chair wasn't just old. It was something else entirely. Her eyes drifted toward the hallway, where the old grandfather clock ticked solemnly. She felt an overwhelming urge to sit in the chair again, to test the limits of her fear, to confront whatever was hiding within it. She didn't know why, but she couldn't ignore it. The curiosity gnawed at her, the feeling that she was being pulled toward it, like a moth to a flame. With a heavy sigh, she crossed the room and placed her hand on the back of the chair. As soon as Grace sat down, the chair groaned beneath her, its weight shifting as though it had just woken up from a long slumber. She stiffened, her fingers curling into the armrests, but she didn't get up. The air seemed to thicken, becoming dense, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Grace closed her eyes and leaned back, trying to calm herself. But then she heard it, the faintest whisper, like a voice murmuring just out of reach. Her eyes snapped open, but the room was still. No movement. No sound. Only the rhythmic creaking of the chair as it slowly rocked back and forth. She strained her ears, her heart pounding. Then, another whisper. Sit still, Grace. Don't move. Just listen. The voice was soft but unmistakably clear. It wasn't her imagination. It was as if the chair itself was speaking to her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she nearly bolted out of the chair, but the voice, a human-like voice, soothing yet tinged with something dark, kept her in place. I won't hurt you. Not yet. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She should have stood up. Should have left the room. But instead, she remained rooted to the chair, her eyes wide in terror as she searched the shadows of the room for the source of the voice. It wasn't coming from anywhere. It was inside her mind. The chair continued to rock. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrests. The voice grew louder now, no longer whispering but speaking directly to her. You don't understand, do you? The chair is mine, and I am yours. A chill swept over her, and the chair's rocking became faster, more erratic. The sudden change sent a shockwave of terror through her body. The voice turned sharper, colder, almost accusing. You think you can escape this? You think you can just walk away? You can't. You belong to it now. To me. Grace's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to stand, to run, but her limbs felt heavy, paralyzed. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter with every second that passed. The voice in her head became a roar, filling her mind with images of hands reaching out from the chair, of dark figures rising from the shadows. Her thoughts raced, crashing into one another. Could she leave? Could she escape this nightmare before it consumed her? The rocking chair creaked one last time. Grace snapped from her trance with a gasp, her hands flying to the armrests as if she were drowning. She scrambled to stand but found herself unable to move. Her body refused to cooperate. It was as though the chair had a hold on her, its power drawing her in, anchoring her to the spot. For a moment, everything was still. The room was silent, but the air felt wrong. It hummed with an energy she couldn't explain, something ancient, something oppressive. She looked around the room, desperate for any kind of reassurance that she was still in control, that none of this was real. But the chair was still rocking. The rocking motion was slow at first, like a gentle lullaby. But with each passing second, it picked up speed, the creaks of the wood growing louder and louder until they reverberated through the house. It was as if the chair was alive, responding to something or someone that was no longer visible. Grace tried again to stand. Her legs were shaking, but she pushed herself up, ignoring the weakness that threatened to pull her back down. But as soon as her feet hit the ground, the chair let out a low, guttural sound. It was a scream, sharp and chilling, one that sent a bolt of terror down her spine. The noise was so sudden, so jarring, that Grace stumbled backward, crashing into the wall with a gasp. The room went cold. The screams from the chair faded, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. Grace turned and bolted for the door, her breath ragged in her chest. She didn't care about the chair anymore. She needed to escape, to get away from the house, from the feeling that it was closing in around her. But as she reached the door, something cold and damp brushed against the back of her neck. She spun around in a panic, but the room was empty. The rocking chair sat silently in the corner, motionless now, except for the whisper. "You can't run. Not from me." Grace's heart stopped. The voice wasn't in her head anymore, it was right behind her. She turned slowly, her stomach dropping. But the room was empty. There was no one there. Nothing. But the voice continued. It was softer now, almost sympathetic. "I gave you a chance to leave. But you'll never leave now. You're mine, Grace. Forever." A chill crawled up her spine as the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, elongating toward her, wrapping around her limbs like invisible hands. The chair's rocking stopped. The house was silent. For now, Grace couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the chair. It loomed in the corner of the room, its presence unnerving in the stillness of the night. She had tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, the whispers, the rocking, the scream that had sent her into a frenzy. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. It wasn't just in her head. The house was silent now. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in the otherwise still air. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was oppressive, stifling, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She hadn't told anyone about the chair yet. Not her friend Sarah, not even her therapist. Grace had never been the type to believe in the supernatural, but now she wasn't so sure. She sat up in bed, her sheets tangled around her legs. The moonlight spilled through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake the exhaustion from her body. She hadn't even realized how long she'd been sitting there until the ticking clock grew louder and louder, until it felt like the sound was vibrating in her skull. But it wasn't the clock that drew her attention, it was the sound of faint rocking. Grace's blood ran cold. She didn't need to look to know what it was. The chair. For a moment, she stayed perfectly still, her breath shallow. But the rocking continued, soft at first, and then faster, the creaking of the wood growing louder, more insistent. It was as if it was calling her, demanding her presence. Reluctantly, Grace threw out the covers and crept out of bed. Her bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor, sending a shiver up her spine. The house was too quiet, too still. The rocking was the only sound now, echoing through the empty house. Her heart was in her throat as she moved toward the door. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to get out, to leave this place behind. But her feet moved forward, her legs carrying her through the hall without a second thought. It was as though her body had taken over, as if something was driving her toward the chair. A force she couldn't control. When she reached the living room, she stood in the doorway, her breath caught in her chest. The chair was rocking again. Grace's hands clenched into fists, and she tried to force herself to step forward, to turn around and leave. But she couldn't. The side of the chair, its dark wood gleaming in the moonlight, its worn cushions creaking with each movement, held her in place. The whispers she had heard earlier seemed to pulse through her, reverberating in her bones. "Come closer, Grace." The voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't just a whisper. It was clear, calling to her, drawing her in like a siren song. The chair stopped rocking. Against her better judgment, Grace crossed the room. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the earth thickening around her as she drew closer to the chair. The shadows stretched longer, almost as though they were alive, curling and twisting as she approached. When she was just a few feet away, the chair let out another sound, a faint whimper, like a breath. It was almost human, the kind of noise someone makes when they're trapped, when they can't breathe. Grace reached out, her fingers brushing the back of the chair. The moment she touched it, a sharp chill shot through her. Her fingers went numb. "Don't sit in it." The thought came unbidden, almost like an echo of her own voice. She pulled her hand back quickly, as though she'd been burned. She knew then that the chair wasn't just cursed. It was alive. It had always been alive. It was feeding on her fear, on her uncertainty. It wanted her to sit in it. It wanted her to belong to it. She turned to leave, but something caught her eye. A small wooden box nestled under the seat of the chair. The box was withered, its edges chipped, but it looked oddly familiar, like something she had seen before, something that had been buried in her mind for years. Curiosity gnawed at her, and before she could stop herself, Grace knelt down and opened it. Inside was an old photograph. A faded black and white image of a woman she didn't recognize, but there was something in her eyes, a strange intensity, a look of pleading. She was sitting in the same chair. Her fingers shook as she held the photo. There, under the woman's hand, was a small slip of paper, crumpled and yellowed with age. Grace unfolded it with trembling hands. The message was simple. The chair never forgets. And neither will I. Grace's mind raced. What did this mean? Was this another victim of the chair? Someone who had been claimed by it, just like Margaret Harrison? Had the chair always been a part of the house, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to come near. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as a cold breeze swept through the room, though the windows were closed. And then she heard it. A scream. It wasn't from the chair this time. It wasn't from the house. It was coming from the photo. Grace's breath hitched in her throat as the woman's face seemed to distort, her eyes widening in terror. The scream that erupted from the photo was so loud, so real, that it made her blood run cold. It was as if the woman was trapped, her cries forever trapped in the paper. Her voice echoed through Grace's mind, filling her with the same dread she had felt sitting in the chair earlier. "Help me!" The scream faded, but Grace could still feel it vibrating in her skull. The weight of it crushed her chest, and she dropped the photograph, stumbling backward as the room seemed to close in on her. The chair creaked again, its rocking slow, deliberate. Grace stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she backed away from the chair. She wanted to run, but her legs felt as if they were made of stone. Her mind was spinning, thoughts colliding and cracking like glass under pressure. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The chair was alive, and it had been alive for decades. She didn't know how long it had been there, how many people it had claimed, but she was certain that Margaret Harrison wasn't the first. And she wouldn't be the last. Her eyes locked on the chair. The chair that screamed. The chair that wanted her. She wanted to scream, to get out of there, to leave the house and never look back. But something inside her, some deep, terrible instinct, told her that if she ran now, if she left, she would never be free. Not until she understood the chair's hold on her. Grace knew, then, that the chair would never let her go. Her mind reeled. There was only one way out, one way to break the chair's power. She had to destroy it. She had to burn it, to rip it apart until it was nothing but ash and dust. But as she turned to leave, to grab the matches from the drawer, a cold voice stopped her. "You can't. I own you now, Grace. Forever." She spun around, her pulse racing, but the chair was empty. Still, she could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. It had already won. The chair's words echoed in Grace's mind, reverberating like a pulse she couldn't escape. She could almost feel the weight of its presence behind her, the unrelenting pressure as if something was slowly tightening around her chest. The air felt thick with menace, every corner of the room cast in shadow, as if the darkness itself was closing in. Grace knew she had to act, but the fear, it paralyzed her. "It owns you now." Those words slithered through her thoughts like a snake, coiling tighter and tighter. She had always prided herself on her control, on her ability to handle the difficult and the dark. But this was something beyond her, something impossible to fight. The rocking chair, its time-worn wood ancient cushions, seemed to mock her. She turned to look at it once more, but this time, the sight filled her not with curiosity but with something far more primal, dread. It sat there, still and silent now, yet its presence screamed louder than any sound. As she stepped backward, a shadow moved across the room, a fleeting, unnatural shift in the light. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She whipped her head around, but nothing was there. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It only grew stronger. She could feel the chair pulling her back in, as though it had become a gravitational force she couldn't escape. "Don't sit in it. Don't you dare." The thought sliced through her, but it felt too late. The moment she touched that chair, the moment she disturbed its peace, she had sealed her fate. She wanted to leave, to run far away, but the house wouldn't let her go. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she slowly backed toward the door, the chair's unspoken pull relentless. For the briefest second, she thought she saw it move, a shift of its own volition, its rocking starting once again, slow at first, then gaining speed. The faint creak of the wood was a sharp reminder that this was real, that this was happening. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the window. Through the half-open blinds, she saw the moon, bright and unblinking in the night sky. She could almost hear it calling to her. It was the only thing in the room that felt real, untainted by the evil that seeped through the walls of the house. The chair's pull had lessened just enough for her to focus on the window, the world outside, her escape. The world where things were normal. But it was far too late. She wasn't free anymore. As Grace reached for the door handle, something whispered her name. Grace. The voice was faint, almost like a breeze, but it held such power that it sent her heart plummeting to the pit of her stomach. It was the same voice, the same pleading tone she had heard earlier, stronger now. She froze. The chair rocked again, louder this time, the rhythmic creaking unnerving. Grace felt the temperature drop suddenly, a coldness invading the air, sharp and biting, as though the house itself was exhaling ice-cold breath. Goosebumps prickled her skin, and her chest tightened. She couldn't escape it. Not the chair. Not its presence. You can't leave. Not now. Grace's hand shook as she grasped the doorknob, but it didn't turn. It was locked. Panic surged through her veins. She pulled harder, but the door wouldn't budge. She yanked on it with all her strength, but the handle only rattled against the frame, mocking her efforts. The voice spoke again, closer this time, behind her. The chair will always call. Always. And now, you will never leave. Grace spun around, but the chair was empty, its cushions undisturbed. No one sat in it. Yet, there was an undeniable presence, an oppressive force pushing down on her. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching longer, reaching toward her, clawing at her skin. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her pulse a heavy drumbeat in her ears. And then, the chair screamed. It was louder this time. Deafening. The sound ripped through the room, a sharp, high-pitched wail that made Grace's skin crawl. The very air seemed to tremble with the force of it, as though the house was crying out in agony. But it wasn't just a scream. It was a human scream. A scream of pain, of terror. She was hearing someone else's suffering now. Someone who had been here before. Someone who had been claimed. Grace staggered back, her knees buckling as the scream assaulted her senses. She wanted to cover her ears, to block it out, but it was inside her head, reverberating in her skull. The sound was endless, a pitch-perfect scream that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. In her mind, she saw flashes. Flickering images. The same woman from the photograph, her face contorted in agony as she sat in the chair, her hands gripping the arms as if she were being held there by some invisible force. Her eyes, wide with fear, seemed to plead for help. The woman's mouth moved, but Grace couldn't hear the words. The scream was louder now, drying everything else out. It filled her body, filled the house, as though the woman was reliving her death, trapped in an eternal cycle of pain. And with each passing moment, Grace could feel it. The chair was alive, and it was feeding on her. Grace collapsed to her knees, clutching her ears in desperation, but the scream wouldn't stop. It consumed her, swallowed her whole, and in that moment, she realized something chilling. She wasn't just hearing the scream. She was becoming part of it. It was too much. The room spun, and the edges of her vision blurred. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wall as she tried to steady herself, but the ground seemed to vanish beneath her. Her heart thudded wildly in her chest. I need to get out. I need to leave. But then, the chair stopped rocking. The room fell silent. The silence was worse than the scream. It was like the calm before a storm, the kind of silence that suffocates. And in that silence, Grace realized she had been standing in the same spot, frozen, for what felt like hours. The house had swallowed her whole, and she couldn't escape. I warned you, the voice murmured, now soft and sweet, like honey in her ear. Grace turned to face the chair, her eyes wide with terror. The once empty seat now bore a figure, a shadowy form, blurred and indistinct, seated in the chair. But she could feel the weight of its stare. You are mine now, Grace, the voice whispered. And the chair screamed once more. Story 3. The statue was an oddity. A grotesque, ivory figure of a man, his posture rigid and unnaturally upright. He stood, head slightly tilted, his eyes lifeless and unblinking. The hands were outstretched, almost as if he were attempting to reach for something just beyond his grasp. The craftsmanship was exquisite, detailed veins in his neck, the ridges of his muscle taut in a display of power, but something about the figure unsettled Alan. There was a wrongness to it, a malice hidden just beneath the polished surface. Alan had first spotted it at an antique shop on the outskirts of town. The shop was dimly lit, packed with relics of forgotten eras, things of beauty and terror alike. His fingers had brushed against the cold glass display case before he even realized he was drawn to it. The statue had been placed in the back corner, its pale surface catching the light, beckoning him forward. Interesting choice, the shopkeeper, a frail old man, had commented. His voice was raspy, like he'd been smoking for decades. Not many people see the beauty in that one. Alan had smiled, trying to conceal the growing discomfort that gnawed at his gut. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt drawn to it, but it was undeniable. There was something about that statue, its frozen form, its blank stare, that tugged at his insides. For a moment, he wondered if it was the history behind it, perhaps the artist's intention to capture a moment of agony, or perhaps a tortured soul sealed in stone. The deeper he looked, the more he felt it staring back at him. After a brief haggling session with the shopkeeper, Alan had purchased the statue, convinced it would fit perfectly in his living room. He thought he could appreciate the beauty of it, the stark contrast it would provide to his otherwise minimalist apartment. At the time, he didn't consider the consequences. Fitting choice for a man who's looking to fill an empty space, the old man had said with a strange smirk. When Alan placed the statue on the mantelpiece in his apartment, he was initially proud of his acquisition. The figure was beautiful in a macabre way, and its smooth, lifelike features seemed to demand attention. At first, it was just another piece of decoration, an unusual item in an otherwise dull room. Alan didn't think much of it when he went to bed that night. But when he woke the next morning, something was wrong. The statue wasn't where he had left it. His eyes snapped open, and a cold shiver ran down his spine as he stared at the mantelpiece. The figure, which had been positioned perfectly in the center, now stood just a few inches to the right. Alan blinked, trying to reconcile what he was seeing. He had been half asleep when he placed it there, but he was sure it had been in the center, facing forward. He shook his head, muttering to himself. It must have fallen, he reasoned. Maybe I didn't set it down right last night. But no! The statue didn't just fall. It had moved. It stood there, too perfectly aligned, too deliberate, just slightly shifted. Alan's unease deepened. The feeling that the statue was watching him, that it was alive in some way, began to take root in his mind. Trying to shake off the discomfort, he set it back in its original position. It had just been an accident. Nothing more. But when he returned home later that day, the statue had moved again. At first, it was just small, subtle movements. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed for attention. Alan tried to tell himself that it was his imagination, that he was just tired, or that perhaps there was some slight shaking of the floor when he walked around. But the movements persisted. The statue would shift ever so slightly to the left or right, always facing a different direction, always closer. The changes were imperceptible at first. A few inches here, an inch there. Alan thought about the possibility that his house wasn't as stable as he thought. Maybe the floors were settling, the vibrations of traffic outside causing minute tremors. But the more time passed, the more the shifts began to feel deliberate. The statue wasn't just moving, it was following him. One evening, after work, Alan was sitting on the couch, staring at his phone when he felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, his gaze landing on the statue. There was no mistaking it now. The figure had moved again, this time a few inches closer, and it was angled at a different position. The same prickling sensation swept over him, as if he could feel the statue's eyes on him, though they remained still, unblinking, fixed. He couldn't explain it. It was just a hunch, a gut feeling, but something about the way the statue stood now unsettled him. It was as though it were aware of him, watching his every movement. In the silence of his apartment, the statue seemed to mock him, daring him to come closer, daring him to confront it. The feeling only deepened when Alan woke the next morning. The statue had moved again. This time, it had come even closer. The next day, Alan decided to take action. He had to see it for himself, this irrational movement that had been nagging at him. He placed a small mark on the floor, just under the statue's base, to measure its location. The next morning, he checked it as soon as he woke up. It had moved. Again. The distance wasn't large, but it was there, just enough for Alan to feel the deep sense of dread begin to rise within him. The statue had moved closer to him, inch by inch, always following him, always in his line of sight. Alan's heart raced, his pulse quickening. He moved the statue back to its original place, but the unease lingered, clinging to him like a shadow. It was around this time that Alan began to question his own sanity. Was he imagining things? Was this all some elaborate trick of his mind? Or was something far darker at work? The thought that the statue might be alive, that it might be following him, seemed absurd. Ridiculous. But with each passing day, the movements continued, getting more pronounced, and Alan's grip on reality began to slip. By now, he was sure of one thing: the statue was no accident. It was alive, and it was following him. Alan couldn't stop watching the statue. Every time he passed the mantelpiece, his gaze inevitably drifted to it. His mind raced with explanations, logical, scientific explanations, but nothing felt right. There was a strange chill in the air whenever he was near it, a sense of being watched that crept under his skin, gnawing at his rationality. He had even tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But how could he? Every morning, it was closer. Every evening, it seemed to move again. One night, Alan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in confusion. The question swirling in his mind: what was happening? Why was this happening? Refused to quiet. The image of the statue's cold, unblinking eyes burned into his mind. He heard the creak of the floorboards. The faintest sound, like a soft shuffle. A sound he was sure he hadn't heard before. Alan's heart pounded. He had to check. He had to know. Pulling himself out of bed, he tiptoed toward the living room, moving carefully so as not to disturb the silence. His eyes immediately landed on the statue. It wasn't just closer. It was different, more alive, somehow. It stood at a new angle, turned slightly, as though it had shifted itself in the night. He froze in place, unable to move. There was a low hum in the room now, barely audible but undeniably there. The statue's pale, carved form almost seemed to ripple in the dim light, as though it were subtly shifting, becoming something else. No. This is insane. This is just my mind playing tricks on me. But his feet felt glued to the floor, his breath shallow. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The statue had not moved, not on its own. But that feeling of being watched, of it silently observing, persisted. And then, just as he began to convince himself it was all a product of his sleepless mind, the floor creaked again. This time, it wasn't in his imagination. It was real. It was as if the statue had shifted. His skin prickled. Alan couldn't deny the growing sense of dread. The next morning, the statue had moved again. This time, it wasn't just an inch or two, it was significantly closer to Alan's chair, its outstretched hands now almost within arm's reach. He stared at it, his mouth dry, his hands trembling. How was this happening? He had checked the previous night. He had marked the floor, carefully noting the statue's exact position. And yet here it was, unnervingly closer. He tried to think of an explanation. Maybe the air conditioning had caused the shift? Perhaps the vibrations from passing cars? No, this wasn't normal. It was deliberate. Every night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Alan found himself unable to sleep. He lay in bed, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. Every night, the same question echoed in his head: why is it getting closer? By the third day, the statue had reached an unsettling proximity. Alan could almost feel the cold, stone fingers brushing against his skin as he sat down in his armchair. The fear started to eat at him, gnawing away at the edges of his sanity. It was too precise, too intentional. No, I'm not imagining this. The rational part of him screamed for answers. The paranoia was relentless. The thought that something else, something sinister, was at play clawed at him. But he refused to believe in the supernatural. Until the day the statue made a sound. It was just after dawn. Alan had stumbled out of bed, still groggy from another sleepless night. The moment his eyes met the statue, he felt it again, the presence, that weighty, suffocating feeling that seemed to radiate from the figure. But this time, something was different. As he walked toward it, his footfalls heavy on the hardwood floor, the air seemed to shift. It was cooler, unnervingly so, and the hair on the back of his neck stood straight up. Alan reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the statue's arm. That's when it happened. A low, guttural noise, a scream, erupted from deep within the statue. It was distorted, muffled, like a human cry smothered under layers of stone and echo. The sound sliced through the room, cold and sharp, sending a bolt of pure terror through Alan's spine. He jerked back, heart racing. His chest tightened and his stomach churned. The scream had come from the statue. A brief silence followed. Alan stood there, frozen, trying to catch his breath. His mind reeled. What had he just heard? Was it real? Was he losing his mind? He couldn't rationalize it. The scream had been unmistakable. The statue was more than a mere figure, it was alive. Alive with a twisted, agonizing presence that wanted him to hear it. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. But it was happening. The statue was no longer just following him, it was communicating with him. Alan stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the statue as if it might scream again. He took a step back, his eyes glued to the figure, and watched as it remained frozen, its unblinking eyes seeming to stare right through him. The scream had shattered something inside him. It was no longer just an inconvenience. The statue was not only closer every day, it had now crossed a line. The reality of it began to settle deep within Alan's mind like a poison. He couldn't dismiss it anymore. That day, he decided to move it. He lifted the statue off the mantelpiece, feeling the weight of it as he carried it across the room. But even as he moved it, the air grew thick with an unnatural cold. The whispering scream echoed in his mind, reverberating with every step. When he set the statue down on the opposite side of the room, the unease didn't leave him. It clung to him like an insidious presence, and he realized the terrifying truth. It wasn't just the statue that was following him. It was something else. He rushed to the window, throwing the blinds open, desperate for some fresh air to clear the suffocating dread that had taken over the room. He needed an escape. But when he turned back to the statue, now on the opposite side of the room, he found it had moved again. Not toward the chair, but closer to the door. Its outstretched hands were reaching for the exit. Alan's breath caught in his throat. The figure was alive. And it was coming for him. Alan couldn't breathe. He stood frozen, staring at the statue. The creature of stone, once a mere ornament in his home, now loomed like a looming predator. Its cold, lifeless eyes stared back at him as though it knew his every fear, every thought. And it was getting closer, closer than ever. The hand stretched out toward the door, like it was reaching for freedom. Or was it reaching for him? Alan wasn't sure anymore. His mind, once rooted in logic, had unraveled into a haze of paranoia and confusion. The scream from earlier echoed in his mind, a deep, unearthly cry that left a hollow emptiness in its wake. He could still hear it, as if the statue were whispering it to him, begging him to understand. But what? What was it trying to tell him? Alan couldn't escape the feeling that the statue was alive, that it was more than just stone. Every movement of his eyes toward it felt like an invasion into a twisted, sinister world he was no longer in control of. What did it want? Why was it following him? Was it even real? The rational part of him screamed to dismiss it, to find another explanation. But no explanation could fit. He had checked the floor, marked its position every night, and still, it moved. "I'm losing my mind," he muttered under his breath, gripping the arm of his chair for support. The dark circles beneath his eyes seemed to deepen with each passing day. He hadn't been able to sleep, hadn't been able to focus. And now, as he stood there, paralyzed by dread, the walls of his own mind began to close in around him. There had to be an explanation. A reason. Maybe the house was haunted. Maybe it was his own isolation playing tricks on him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't dismiss the truth. The statue was alive. It wasn't a trick of the mind. The closer it got to the door, the more its presence seemed to throb, pulsing like a dark, twisted heartbeat. The fear gnawed at his insides. Alan stumbled back toward the kitchen, grabbing the nearest object he could find, a heavy, iron skillet. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing that could protect him in this house that had once felt safe, but now felt like a prison. The statue was moving again. When Alan returned to the living room, the statue was closer still. His heart slammed against his ribs, and his mind spiraled deeper into madness. He had moved it. He had placed it far from him. Yet somehow, it had inched even closer. Its eyes, those piercing, empty eyes, seemed to follow his every movement. "Stop," Alan whispered, his voice trembling as he approached the statue. He could feel the unnatural cold in the air growing thicker, like the room itself was holding its breath. It didn't stop. It never stopped. Alan could feel his mind crumbling under the weight of it. The days had begun to blur together, and sleep, if it could be called that, had become a distant memory. He was losing himself, and the statue had become his only reality. He thought he could hear it, whispering, at the edges of his consciousness. He gripped the skillet tighter, his knuckles white. The idea of smashing it against the statue was almost a relief. It would be an end, a closure. But something stopped him. What if it screamed again? What if the scream was worse this time? What if it wanted him to break it? He took a deep breath, summoning the courage to step closer. His gaze darted back to the statue. The thing was alive. Every inch of it emanated something unholy, something dark. And yet, Alan couldn't turn away. What had started as an innocent piece of art had become a terrifying force that warped reality itself. The statue had a life of its own, a mind that he could not understand, a hunger that seemed to grow with each passing second. And it was getting closer. The sound of creaking floorboards interrupted his thoughts. Slowly, Alan turned his head to the door. It wasn't the statue moving. It was something else. As the air grew heavier, Alan's eyes adjusted to the shadows in the room. Something was in the room with him now. He could feel it, the way the temperature dropped, how the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and shift. It wasn't the statue, but something else that had taken its place, something that had come from the statue. He heard it again, a low, drawn-out whisper coming from the direction of the mantelpiece. Alan. He blinked, his heart racing. The whisper wasn't in his ears, it was in his mind. He could hear it clearly now, a voice that was low, raspy, and desperate. "Help me." The words didn't feel like they came from the statue. They felt like they came from deep inside the house, from within the very walls themselves. They were coming from everywhere. The air around him seemed to close in, thick with an oppressive weight. "No, no, no," he muttered, shaking his head furiously. "This isn't real. This is just the stress. It's just the stress." But even as he spoke the words, Alan knew they were hollow. The whispers didn't stop. "Help me." The voice called again, softer this time, pleading. Alan felt his mind start to unravel further. He had to get out. The suffocating presence in the room had grown unbearable. He didn't look back as he bolted for the door. The thing that followed him wasn't just a statue anymore. It was a force, an evil that seeped into the walls, into his very soul. It had followed him into every waking moment, and now it had followed him into his thoughts, his dreams, his very being. By the time Alan reached the door, the whispers had stopped. There was nothing but silence in the house. But the silence felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. He stood at the threshold, staring at the door handle. Should he leave? Could he leave? But then the thought hit him, the realization that had been creeping in, slow but undeniable. If he left now, would the statue follow him? Could he escape it? His eyes drifted back to the living room where the statue stood, waiting. It was no longer just a thing made of stone. It was a thing of terror. And it was waiting for him to make his final move. Alan had to make a decision. He had to choose. With his heart in his throat, Alan made his way back to the mantelpiece. He placed the skillet on the floor and reached out toward the statue. The room was deathly still. And then it moved again. Alan's hand hovered just inches away from the cold, stone surface of the statue. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, as if the very room were alive with the sound of his terror. The air was thick with an unseen presence, something so heavy it felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The statue had stopped moving, for now, but Alan knew, with a certainty that chilled into his bones, that this was not the end. The statue wasn't just following him anymore. It had become part of him. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. Its eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, were always watching him. Always waiting. "It's not real," he whispered to himself, though the words felt fragile, breaking apart as soon as they left his lips. It's not real. But it was real. The thing in the living room, the whispers in his mind, the way it moved. It was all too real. Alan didn't know what was worse, the thing itself, or the realization that he had allowed it to seep into his soul. He had been so sure he could control it, that he could understand it, but now, standing here with his hand so close to the cursed stone, he knew it had already won. And there was no escaping it. He turned away from the statue, and for the first time in days, the weight of the room began to lift, if only for a second. He could almost taste freedom in the air, just a little more. If he could get out, if he could just leave the house behind. But But where would he go? There was nowhere to run. The statue had followed him to every corner of his home, and it would follow him wherever he went. Even if he escaped physically, it would still haunt him, lurking in the deepest corners of his mind, pressing in like a weight he could never outrun. Alan stumbled back toward the door. He couldn't stay here anymore. He couldn't fight this thing on his own. It was too much for him. As he reached for the door handle, a sound stopped him. A soft creak. And then, a whisper, a voice that was not his own. "You can't escape me, Alan." It was not a threat. It was a promise. The room seemed to darken as the whisper echoed in his ears. Alan's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, eyes wide with terror. The statue. It was no longer still. Its eyes, once empty and unmoving, were now alive, twisting, contorting, and narrowing with an unnatural hunger. The stone was no longer stone. It was shifting, transforming, as if the very fabric of reality itself was warping to the will of the statue. Alan gasped as the thing began to move, its limbs shifting in unnatural ways, cracking and breaking free from the bonds of cold stone. The scream, a human-like scream, broke from its lips, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was the scream of something other, something monstrous that had been awakened from a deep, slumbering nightmare. It was alive. The statue's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, its eyes wide with glee. "You shouldn't have touched me," the voice hissed, no longer a whisper but a guttural, scraping sound that reverberated through the room. "You shouldn't have woken me." Alan stumbled back, his legs trembling. He reached for the door, but the handle felt impossibly far away. The statue was closer now, its stone body pulsing as though it were breathing, its eyes fixed on Alan with an unrelenting stare. "No," Alan whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, this can't be happening." But the statue was happening. It moved closer. Alan's mind reeled as he tried to process the horror unfolding before him. How had it come to this? How had he let this thing into his life? The answers slipped through his mind like sand through fingers, impossible to hold on to. No. It's not real. It's not real. But it was. Alan could see it with his own eyes, could feel the dread seeping into his skin, crawling under it, like something alive, burrowing deep. The statue wasn't just a thing. It wasn't just stone. It was alive. And now, it was coming for him. Alan could feel his mind splitting. There were no more choices, no more decisions. The horror had him by the throat, choking the air from his lungs. His eyes darted around the room, searching for some way out, but there was nothing. No escape. No chance. In that moment, Alan understood this wasn't just about the statue. It had never been just about the statue. The horror was inside him. It had always been inside him, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The statue had simply been the vessel, the catalyst. It had fed on Alan's own fear, his own isolation. And now, it had become a part of him impossible to separate. A terrible realization washed over him. It was never about breaking free. It was about becoming part of it. Alan's breathing quickened. He could hear the statue's voice again, scraping against his thoughts like nails on glass. I will follow you forever, Alan. His vision blurred, the room spinning. The statue moved again, closer now, its form twisting in unnatural ways. Alan backed away, his body trembling with the knowledge that there was no escape. The thing was right behind him now, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed him completely. His fingers touched the door handle, but before he could turn it, the statue's voice echoed one final time, sending a shock of icy terror down his spine. You are mine now. And the door slammed shut behind him. Alan's screams echoed through the empty house, but no one was there to hear them. No one but the statue. The thing that had followed him, that had become a part of him, would never let him go. And in the end, that was the true horror. It was not the statue that haunted him, it was what it had turned him into. Alan would never escape. And every morning, when the sun rose, the statue would be there, waiting. Always watching. Always following. Story 4. The Caldwell family had arrived in the middle of an autumn evening, their moving truck barely squeezing up the winding path that led to the mansion. The place loomed over them, a dark silhouette against the orange glow of the setting sun. Emily, her husband Carl, and their 2 children, Lucy and Mark, all stood in awe of the house as they unloaded their things. The mansion, which seemed to have been abandoned for ages, gave off an air of quiet solemnity. Once the house was unpacked and they began to settle in, Emily had mixed feelings. There was something about the mansion that was almost too grand for them. The towering rooms, the old paintings on the walls, the thick drapes that made the air feel heavier. Still, it was theirs now, and they needed to make it a home. But the portrait, it was unavoidable. It hung in the parlor, perfectly framed in a gold leaf frame that seemed to glow unnaturally, even in the dim light of the house. The portrait was a picture of Jonathan Caldwell, their distant ancestor. The man's sharp features stood out in stark contrast to the faded colors of the painting. His clothes were rich, but not quite fashionable by today's standards. He was a man of wealth, but not a man of kindness. His eyes, dark, soulless, and penetrating, seemed to follow Emily wherever she went. At first, Emily tried to ignore it. After all, it was just an old family portrait, wasn't it? But there was something about the stillness of Jonathan's face. His mouth was set in a tight line, as if he were on the verge of speaking but somehow unable to. The first night, as Emily and Carl were unpacking boxes in the bedroom, Emily caught a glimpse of the portrait again. For a moment, she could have sworn that Jonathan's lips twitched. The thought came to her only in passing, and she dismissed it quickly. It's just a painting, she told herself. Nothing to worry about. The second night was when things began to feel different. The air inside the house, which had been stuffy during the day, grew strangely cold by midnight. Carl had fallen asleep beside her, leaving Emily wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence in the house was profound, so thick that it pressed against her eardrums. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound that broke the stillness. But then she heard it. At first, it was a whisper, so faint that it could have been the wind rustling through the leaves outside. But as Emily strained to listen, it became clear, a voice. It was coming from the parlor. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't move immediately. What was that sound? Her eyes flicked over to Carl, who was lying next to her, sound asleep, unaware of the growing tension in the house. Slowly, she slid out of bed, careful not to wake him. Her bare feet brushed the cold wooden floor, sending a shiver up her spine. She stood at the doorway, pressing her ear against the wall. The whispering continued. It was unintelligible, but there was no mistaking the desperation in the tone. The voice was low, almost guttural, as though struggling to push through some barrier. It sounded like someone trapped behind the walls, pleading for help, or perhaps warning her. It's just the house settling, Emily told herself, even though she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Just an old house, making noise in the night. But as she crept closer to the parlor, the whispering became louder, more frantic. It was coming from the portrait. The room was bathed in shadows, but she could swear that Jonathan Caldwell's lips were moving. Her breath caught in her throat. The voice, no longer a whisper, but a breathless, strained murmur echoed in her mind. "Help me." It was soft, barely audible, but there was something so haunting in it that Emily could feel her chest tighten with unease. She took a step forward, her feet now moving on their own accord, drawn by some force she couldn't understand. As she entered the parlor, she noticed that the painting, Jonathan's portrait, was framed directly opposite the door. His face seemed more vivid now, his eyes more intense. And then, she saw it. Jonathan's lips, which had been motionless hours before, now twitched again. Not just a subtle shift this time, but distinct, purposeful movements, like a man trying to speak but struggling against something invisible, something that bound him. She gasped, but no sound came out. It was as though time stood still for a moment. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped, and the room returned to its deathly silence. The portrait of Jonathan Caldwell hung as it always had, his lips now frozen once again in that rigid and motionless line. "I'm losing my mind," Emily thought, backing away slowly. "This isn't real." Her heart thudded in her chest, the beats almost too loud in the stillness. She turned and fled back to her room, slipping under the covers with trembling hands. The whispering had stopped. Carl was still sleeping, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew this was only the beginning. The following morning, Emily tried to dismiss the event as a figment of her imagination. After all, it was just a painting. Just an old house. Nothing could have happened. She tried to put on a brave face, serving breakfast as though nothing had changed. Carl was his usual self, cheerful, oblivious to the strange occurrences that were beginning to pile up. But Emily couldn't ignore the feeling in the pit of her stomach. The weight of the house hung over her like an oppressive fog, and every glance at Jonathan's portrait made her heart race. That night, as the house fell into its usual rhythm of quiet, Emily's unease continued to grow. The whispering began again, faint at first, like the wind in the trees outside, but then louder, more deliberate. She could hear it now, as though it were coming directly from the painting itself. Carl, lost in his sleep, didn't stir. This time, Emily wasn't paralyzed with fear. She knew what she had to do. She had to see it again. She had to understand. Was she losing her mind? Or was something truly wrong? So, she got out of bed, just as she had the night before, and made her way down the long hallway toward the parlor. Her hands were clammy with dread, her breath shallow as she entered the room. The whispering, though soft, filled the air like the rustling of old pages in an ancient book. The portrait. There it was again. Jonathan's lips were moving as if he were saying something, but Emily couldn't make out the words. And then his eyes, those cold, unfeeling eyes, seemed to shift, following her as she moved closer. "Help me," the voice rasped, louder now, clearer. She felt her knees weaken. Her heart pounded in her ears. What did he want? And why was he speaking to her? But before she could move closer to investigate, the voice stopped. The room grew cold, colder than it had been before. The whispering ceased, and for a moment, all that was left was the weight of silence pressing down on her chest. Emily turned and fled back to her room, her mind whirling. The whispering had stopped, but the tension in the air remained. Jonathan's gaze was now permanently etched in her mind, his eyes burning into her thoughts. What was happening to her? What was happening in the house? By the end of the week, the family had settled into the house, more or less, but Emily's anxiety only deepened. Each night, the whispers returned, and every morning she woke to find that Jonathan's portrait seemed just a little closer. His eyes, once staring coldly straight ahead, now seemed to track her movements as she moved around the house. His lips, still frozen in that unnerving line, remained in constant motion. And Emily knew, she knew, that the whispering had to be coming from him. She had to tell Carl. But how? How could she explain this madness? Finally, one evening, Emily sat Carl down after dinner, her hand shaking as she looked at him. "Carl, something's wrong. The portrait, it moves. Every night, I hear it whispering to me. It's like he's speaking to me, and I..." Carl frowned, clearly concerned, but skeptical. "Emily, you're imagining things. The painting's just old. And this house, well, it makes all sorts of noises. I think you're just stressed from the move." But Emily couldn't accept that. Every night, Jonathan's lips moved. Every morning, his gaze was closer to hers. She could feel it. Something was wrong. The following days were a blur for Emily. Each morning she woke with a sense of dread pooling deep in her stomach, like a dark cloud hanging over her every step. No matter how hard she tried to distract herself with the mundane tasks of settling into the house, putting away clothes, organizing the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Carl had brushed off her concerns, but Emily had begun to feel a dissonance between their two realities. For him, the house was simply old, full of creaks and groans, nothing more than an antique relic. But for her, it was a living thing, pressing on her from every corner. The whispering had returned, of course, and now it was louder, more distinct. It was as though the house itself was filled with breath, every wall exhaling in unison with Jonathan's phantom voice. Emily tried to tell herself it was all in her head, that she was letting the atmosphere of the house get to her, allowing the unsettling isolation of the place to warp her perception. But then, there was the portrait. Every night, it was closer. This night was no different. She stood in the doorway to the parlor once again, watching Jonathan's face in the dim light. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth behind her, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. Carl had gone to bed early again, exhausted from a long day of unpacking boxes, but Emily was wide awake, the soft whispering calling her like an invisible tether pulling her into the parlor. "Help me, Emily." She froze. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable. She could almost hear the desperation, the pleading. It was as if Jonathan wasn't just trying to speak, he was trying to reach her. His lips moved with deliberate slowness, an unnatural cadence that made her heart hammer in her chest. His eyes were wide open now, locked directly onto hers, his expression twisted in something between anger and agony. For a moment, she thought she might faint. The air grew heavier, thicker, and the temperature in the room dropped significantly. A chill ran down her spine, and a cold sweat broke out along her neck. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening in its urgency. Emily. Before she could move, the room seemed to blur around her, her vision narrowing on the painting. Jonathan's lips were moving so fast now, it almost looked as though he were screaming, though no sound was coming from him. She felt her breath catch in her throat as she stumbled back, her legs unsteady. She had to get out of the room, had to. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Everything went still. The silence that followed was oppressive, the air thick with the weight of something watching. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt a presence, something close. The feeling was as tangible as the floor beneath her feet. Her body moved on its own accord, retreating into the hallway, her feet echoing in the emptiness. Her head spun, and she pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself. She was losing it, she thought. This isn't real. But the portrait had moved. She had seen it with her own eyes. The next day, Emily was determined to get to the bottom of the madness. She couldn't live in this house anymore if it meant being tormented by Jonathan Caldwell's twisted portrait every night. She had to understand what was happening to her. When Carl left for work, she took the opportunity to conduct a thorough investigation of the house. She started with the parlor, standing in front of the portrait and staring at Jonathan's frozen face. His dark eyes followed her every movement, and for a moment, Emily thought she could hear his voice again, faint and distant. But she quickly shook it off. The portrait had been in the family for generations, she knew that. Her research into the house had revealed that the Caldwell family, who had once owned the estate, was a long line of wealthy but deeply troubled individuals. There were whispers of madness, family feuds, and strange deaths that had occurred within the mansion's walls. But no mention of a haunting, not until Emily started experiencing the whispers. Emily had been collecting old journals left behind by previous family members. Most of them seemed innocuous, diaries from women who had lived in the mansion long before her. But one, a leather-bound journal belonging to Jonathan Caldwell himself, stood out. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was sharp, filled with details about the family's rise to power. There were accounts of business dealings, of parties, of a lavish lifestyle. But toward the end of the journal, the writing became erratic, as if Jonathan had been losing his mind. It read, "I cannot escape it. The portrait speaks to me in the night. Its eyes follow me. I can feel the weight of his gaze, and I know he is alive, waiting for me to join him." Emily's stomach churned as she read the words. Was Jonathan's madness contagious? Or was it something more sinister, something tied to the painting itself? 2.3, the warning. That night, Carl insisted they take a walk together to clear their heads, but Emily had no intention of leaving the house. She had to confront whatever was happening to her. As soon as Carl left the room, Emily crept down the hallway, her pulse quickening with each step toward the parlor. The whispering was already there, soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. But as she entered the room, it grew louder, more insistent. "Emily, help me." Her heart skipped. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the air thickening with each passing second. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Something in her had snapped. She had to know. Her gaze locked onto Jonathan's portrait. His lips were moving again, more pronounced this time. His eyes followed her every movement, his expression becoming more contorted, more desperate. She couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too heavy. Slowly, she approached the painting, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the frame. A jolt of energy coursed through her fingertips when they made contact with the gold leaf wood. The shock was enough to make her stagger back. The temperature in the room plummeted. She could hear her teeth chattering, her breath now visible in the freezing air. Then it happened. The portrait's lips stretched into a grotesque, unnatural smile. A horrible crackling sound filled the room, as though bones were snapping into place. Jonathan's face shifted, a slow, painful transformation that left Emily breathless. She stepped back, the blood draining from her face as Jonathan's voice echoed in the room, louder and louder. "You shouldn't have touched it." Her blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, Emily woke in a cold sweat, disoriented and trembling. The nightmare had felt too real, too vivid to be just a dream. Her heart was still pounding in her chest as she sat up, trying to steady her breathing. But something was different now. The portrait was gone. She jumped out of bed, her feet hitting the cold floor as she rushed to the parlor. The walls, the furniture, the entire room seemed unchanged, except for one thing. The portrait of Jonathan Caldwell had vanished. In its place, there was a new picture, an empty canvas, devoid of color, like a blank page. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for the canvas, confusion and fear flooding her mind. She spun around, looking desperately for any sign of Jonathan's presence. And then she heard it, the soft whispering again, but this time it wasn't coming from the portrait. It was coming from behind her. "Help me." Emily turned slowly, her heart leaping into her throat. Jonathan was standing there, in the doorway. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with Jonathan, or what was left of him. His figure stood in the doorway, tall and gaunt, the edges of his form rippling like the faintest shadows. He wasn't quite solid, he was there, but not entirely, as though the world itself was reluctant to acknowledge his existence. He looked much the same as the portrait, but there was something deeply wrong with him now. His eyes, once filled with pride, were now hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull at her very soul. She staggered back, her legs weak and her chest tight with panic. Her mind scrambled for a way to explain what was happening, but there was no explanation. She had read the journals. She had seen the portrait move. She had heard the whispers. But this was something beyond all comprehension. "Jonathan," she whispered, though her voice quivered with fear. What are you?" Jonathan's mouth twisted into a grotesque semblance of a smile. His lips barely moved, but the voice that came out was unmistakable, deep and hollow, like the sound of a distant, cracking stone. "I am what you summoned," he said, his voice reverberating through the walls of the house, drawing out every other sound. Emily stumbled backwards into the parlor, her eyes never leaving his form as it glided toward her. She could see now, with growing horror, that he wasn't walking. He was simply there, his feet hovering inches above the ground, his body flickering in and out of reality like a bad transmission. "Why? Why are you here?" she asked, her words barely a whisper. She didn't know if she was asking Jonathan or the house itself, for at this point, she wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Jonathan's eyes glinted with something far older than human curiosity. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing in a way that made Emily's skin crawl. "You opened the door," he murmured. "Now, there's no turning back. I have waited for so long." Her heart thundered in her chest, threatening to escape her ribcage as she took a step back, her hands trembling. She knew that Jonathan wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else, something inhuman, something that had seeped out of the canvas and into her world. And it wasn't just Jonathan, there was something darker at play here. A malevolent presence that had been festering in the house long before her family had even arrived. As her mind reeled, Emily thought of the journal again, the entry she had read about Jonathan's descent into madness. There were things he'd written, fragments of his mind that spoke of rituals, of the family's obsession with immortality, and the strange power of the portrait. But there was one entry that stood out to Emily more than the rest, one that haunted her with its implication. "I sealed my soul within the painting to escape death. But I am bound to it now. The portrait is not merely art, it is a vessel, a prison. And every soul that gazes upon it becomes part of my collection. They are mine. All of them." Emily's pulse raced as she recalled the words. She had thought it was just madness at first. But now, standing face to face with the very man who had written them, the truth crashed over her like an unstoppable wave. The portrait was not just a reflection of Jonathan's image. It was a trap, a prison, and Jonathan had trapped himself in it. Or had he been forced to? She couldn't say. But now, the trap had been sprung, and she was caught in it. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to release you." Jonathan's form seemed to flicker again, his features becoming distorted. The unnatural smile on his face twisted into something darker, something that made her stomach churn. "You freed me," he said, his voice now dripping with malice. "And now I will never leave. Neither will you." Emily staggered backward, her mind struggling to keep up with the madness that was unfolding in front of her. Jonathan's form hovered, flickering and distorting, his eyes never leaving hers. But the worst part, by far, was the whispering. It was all around her now, 100 voices overlapping in a chorus of agony, pleading, begging. It was the voice of Jonathan, but it was also the voice of others, the souls trapped within the painting, their agony reverberating through the house. "Help me, Emily. Please." Her name echoed through her mind, bouncing off the walls, filling the space like a swarm of insects. She could feel the weight of their voices pressing in on her, suffocating her. The air was thick now, heavy with despair, and she felt the temperature drop to an unbearable chill. Every breath she took seemed to freeze her lungs. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers stopped. Silence. A hollow, suffocating silence that made her heart race even faster. The absence of sound was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. In the absence of the voices, the house seemed to grow larger, more oppressive. The walls pressed in on her, closing her off from the world outside. Jonathan's eyes glowed with an eerie light, his gaze unblinking. He was closer now, his form no longer flickering, but solid, like a real person, like a specter that had come to life. His presence seemed to grow with every passing second, his shadow stretching across the room, consuming the light. "You are mine," he repeated, his voice no longer echoing through the house, but coming from within her own mind. "I have always been watching. And now, you are part of me. All that you are, all that you've been, will belong to me forever." Emily took a step back, her body frozen in place, her mind spinning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight, her thoughts tangled in the suffocating haze of terror. In that moment, the reality of the situation crashed down on her. The portrait, the whispering, Jonathan, everything had been a trap. A trap that she had unwittingly triggered. And now, she was just another victim. Just another soul claimed by the painting. And there was no escape. As Emily stood there, paralyzed with fear, something strange happened. The world around her seemed to slow down. The shadows lengthened, and the walls groaned as if the house itself was shifting, its foundation crumbling under the weight of what had been unleashed. She glanced once more at the blank canvas, the empty frame that had once held Jonathan's image. It was no longer a mere picture. It had become a portal, a doorway to the other side. Jonathan's hollow gaze never left her. His smile had faded, replaced by something far more terrifying, an expression of knowing. He knew what she was thinking. He knew the terrible choice she was about to make. Emily's heart pounded as she turned toward the door. She had to leave, had to escape before the darkness consumed her completely. But the door would not open. She shoved against it, panicking, her breath ragged in her chest. It felt as though the very house itself had locked her in. "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "No, no, no." But the door wouldn't budge. Jonathan's voice, cold and cruel, echoed in her ears. "You are mine now, Emily, and you will never leave. None of you will." And in that moment, she understood. The house wasn't haunted by Jonathan Caldwell. It was haunted by all of them, every soul that had been trapped inside the canvas. Every victim. Every ghost. And now, Emily was part of it. There was no turning back. The air in the room thickened, pressing against Emily's chest with the weight of 1,000 forgotten souls. She could hear the faint whispers again, but this time they weren't just voices, they were screams, desperate cries that clawed at the very fabric of her mind. She tried to block them out, to focus on the door, but the reality around her began to warp, twisting like a cruel nightmare. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if alive, their surfaces covered in peeling paint and growing mold. The windows shattered, revealing nothing but darkness beyond, an infinite abyss that beckoned her into its cold, suffocating embrace. Every shadow stretched longer, deeper, consuming the light in an eerie dance. Jonathan's presence was a weight, a palpable force that made the world feel smaller, more fragile. His eyes locked onto hers, glowing faintly in the oppressive dark, and Emily felt her sanity fraying. She couldn't think clearly anymore. The whispers wrapped around her, pulling her into their fold, offering her comfort, or perhaps torment. It was hard to tell. Her heart raced, each beat seeming to pulse with a mounting dread of something she couldn't escape. The portrait, it moved. It was no longer confined to the frame, it was everywhere, in the walls, in the air, in the space around her, alive and hungry. The last traces of reality dissolved. She could feel it, as if the very house was giving into whatever had been unleashed. The floor beneath her feet buckled, and she stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden shift. She looked down, and the hardwood floor was no longer solid. It was writhing, twisting like a mass of flesh, veins and tendrils creeping up her legs, binding her in place. "No!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and panicked, but the words came out distorted, like echoes from another time. She reached for the door again, her hands trembling, but the space between her and the exit seemed to stretch, growing farther away the harder she tried to reach it. The whispers grew louder, her name, her family's name, all of it tangled in the static of terror. And then, in the suffocating silence, Emily heard it. A whisper. "Stay," it said, the voice familiar, yet alien, Jonathan's voice. Jonathan's figure loomed before her, more solid now than ever. His once gaunt features were sharper, more defined, and his eyes were full of a hunger that reached beyond human understanding. He tilted his head slightly, a mocking grin tugging at his lips. "Do you see now, Emily?" he asked, his voice low and resonant. It reverberated through her bones, causing her to tremble involuntarily. "You were never meant to leave. You were never meant to escape." The room around them seemed to shift again, warping and stretching as though the fabric of the world itself was unraveling. The house groaned in protest, as if fighting against the pull of something otherworldly. Emily's legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her head spinning with the realization that everything she had tried to outrun had finally caught up with her. This house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It had always been alive, a breathing entity that had long since outgrown its physical boundaries. And now, with Jonathan's soul fully freed from the confines of the portrait, it seemed to be feeding on the very essence of the house, pulling it into the darkness, dragging everything into the abyss. Jonathan's form flickered, his body becoming more transparent with each passing second. It was clear to Emily now, the painting, the whispers, the strange occurrences, it had all been leading to this moment. Jonathan had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to free him, to unravel the fabric of time and space, so he could claim his prize, Emily's soul, her existence, her family's legacy. "The house," he murmured, his voice distant now, as if calling from a great distance. "It feeds. And now it has fed on you, Emily." Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the full extent of the horror she had awakened. The house, once a symbol of family and heritage, had become a prison. And now, she was part of its twisted legacy. But there was more. Emily's mind whirred with a single, terrifying thought. Her family, her parents, her brother, had they already become part of it? Were they already claimed by the house, trapped like Jonathan had been, their souls devoured by the painting that never ceased to call for more? "No, no," she cried, her voice breaking as she scrambled to her feet. But it was too late. She could feel the air around her thickening, pulling her down, suffocating her with a force that was both invisible and inescapable. Jonathan's face seemed to fade into the wall, merging with the darkness. His laugh echoed in her ears, a twisted sound that made her blood run cold. Emily's vision blurred. The edges of the room seemed to ripple as if the world itself was falling apart. Her heart beat so loudly she thought it might shatter her chest. She was no longer sure what was real, Was the house alive? Was Jonathan alive? Was this a nightmare, or had she crossed over into something far worse? No, no, she whispered, her eyes darting around the room. She needed to think, to do something, anything to escape. Her fingers brushed against the cold, warped surface of the portrait. The edges of the frame felt unnaturally smooth, as though it were made from something other than wood. Something alive. She gasped as the portrait shifted again. This time, Jonathan's image was not just moving. His lips, his eyes, his hands, they were all shifting, contorting in ways that should have been impossible. His figure, once so fixed, began to warp in a grotesque dance of horror. His mouth opened wider, stretching impossibly far, until it looked like a gaping maw, ready to swallow her whole. "Join me, Emily," he whispered through the distorted mouth of the painting. "You've already given me everything. You can't escape now." The walls around her trembled. The house screamed with 1,000 voices. The whispers, now deafening, filled every corner of her mind. Emily had no choice but to face the truth. There was no escape. The house had claimed her. It had claimed her family. And now, it wanted her to become part of its endless cycle, its never-ending hunger. As she reached for the portrait, her hands trembling, she could feel the pull. The air thickened, and her vision began to fade. The painting was pulling her in, wrapping around her like a shroud. The darkness closed in around her, swallowing the room, the house, everything. With a final, desperate scream, Emily vanished into the canvas, her form merging with the portrait, just as Jonathan had done before her. The house was quiet now, but only for a moment. For it was always hungry. And soon, another would come to feed it. The mirror had always been an odd purchase. Claire had been reluctant at first, but the antique shop had an air of melancholy about it, one of those places where the objects seem to whisper to you, pull at you when you least expect it. It was the kind of store that attracted the curious and the brave-hearted, or maybe just the lonely. When she had walked in, it had been a rainy day, and the small bell above the door had chimed faintly, like the sound of a distant memory. The mirror stood at the back of the room, hidden behind a curtain of dust and cobwebs, its frame intricately carved with swirls and symbols that Claire couldn't place. She had always been a fan of antiques, and the mirror called to her with a strange, irresistible force. It was beautiful, too beautiful. As soon as she placed her hand on the glass, the shopkeeper's voice had cracked through the silence, almost as if he had been waiting for her to touch it. "That's no ordinary mirror, miss," he had said, his voice raspy, low. "You'd be wise to be careful with it." She had looked at him skeptically, but he had insisted, mumbling about family curses, memories trapped in glass. She didn't believe him, of course. But something had made her hesitate for a moment, an eerie unease that prickled the back of her neck. Despite his warnings, Claire bought it. It was hers now, and when she set it up in her apartment, tucked into the corner of her bedroom next to a stack of old books and dusty furniture, it felt like an odd but welcome addition to her home. A curiosity, a little piece of history, something for her to look at when the silence of the nights grew too heavy. It started simply enough. At first, Claire hardly took notice of the mirror. It wasn't like she had an obsession with it, or so she thought. It sat quietly in the corner of her room, its surface reflecting nothing more than the mundane sights of her apartment, the bed, the window, her own tired face as she brushed her hair in the morning. But then, one night, after a long day at work, she noticed something strange. She had stood before it, her reflection staring back at her as she ran a comb through her hair. The evening light was fading, the room dim, and the reflection was almost too clear, too perfect. For a moment, she thought she saw flicker in the glass, a shadow passing in the background, but when she looked over her shoulder, the room was empty. Thinking nothing of it, she went about her evening, but there was an unease in the air that hadn't been there before. The mirror seemed to watch her now, its surface gleaming slightly, as if waiting for something. When she woke up the next morning, the reflection was as normal as ever, her face looking weary from lack of sleep. Yet, as the days passed, Claire began to feel something more, something lurking behind the smooth glass. A few nights later, after another exhausting day, Claire found herself standing before the mirror again. She had brushed her teeth, changed into her pajamas, and was about to crawl into bed when she caught a strange movement in the reflection. She stared for a long moment, blinking. There, in the corner of the mirror's surface, she could have sworn there was a figure, a shadowy figure, standing just behind her. Her heart raced, and she turned quickly to look over her shoulder. But there was no one there. The room was empty, as it should have been. The mirror, however, still showed that faint, flickering movement. She shook her head, dismissing it. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," she muttered aloud. "It's late. You're tired." But the unease in her stomach remained. Every time she looked into the mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for her. And with each passing day, the sense of dread grew. Something about the mirror was off. The light that reflected from it seemed different, colder, like it was somehow reflecting a world that didn't quite match the one she lived in. Then came the first whisper. It was subtle at first, so faint she almost didn't hear it. She had just gotten out of the shower and was drying her hair when she noticed it. A soft, indistinct murmur, as though someone were standing right behind her, speaking in hushed tones. Her hand froze midair, towel draped over her shoulders, eyes fixed on the mirror. But the reflection remained unchanged. She glanced around the room nervously. The apartment was silent, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. Her heart was thudding in her chest. Another murmur, closer this time. Claire's blood ran cold. She turned, staring at the room behind her, but no one was there. "Hello?" she called out cautiously, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Just the hum of the refrigerator. Her eyes flicked back to the mirror, and that's when it hit her, the reflection wasn't quite right. Her face, her tired eyes, were staring back at her. But something was different. Her mouth, her reflection's mouth, was moving. Slowly. Her lips were whispering words Claire couldn't quite make out. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she stumbled back, tripping over the rug beneath her feet. The mirror seemed to freeze for a moment, the lips of her reflection no longer moving. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the mirror was no longer just a silent observer, but an entity that remembered things it shouldn't. The next few days were strange, unsettling. Claire couldn't bring herself to approach the mirror again. Every time she passed it, the feeling of being watched washed over her, an overwhelming sensation that someone was standing just behind her. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work and the usual rhythms of her life. But each night, the unease only deepened. One evening, while lying in bed, Claire found herself awake, staring at the ceiling. The shadows cast by the streetlights outside seemed too sharp, too distorted, and she couldn't help but feel that they were moving. She thought about the mirror, the whispers, the movements. What was happening to it? To her? Was she losing her mind? Her thoughts turned back to the moment she'd bought the mirror. The shopkeeper had been so strange, so insistent on warning her about it. But why? Why had she dismissed him so easily? She couldn't remember exactly why she'd been so determined to buy it. Something about it had been irresistible, almost like it had been waiting for her. But the question that lingered was, why was the mirror showing her things she couldn't remember? Things she had long forgotten? She turned over in bed and stared at the mirror across the room. The reflection of her dimly lit bedroom stared back at her, empty and still. But now, as she lay there, she swore she saw something else. A flicker. A fleeting moment, a shadow of a person standing by the window. Her heart leaped, and she shot upright in bed. She rushed to the mirror, trembling. The reflection was unchanged, just her tired, fearful face staring back at her. But something was off. The edges of the reflection seemed darker, murkier, as if it had begun to lose clarity. The sharpness of the colors around her seemed to dim. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, but every time she closed her eyes, she felt the pull of the mirror. By morning, exhaustion weighed on her, but something drove her to face it once more. She stood before it, her reflection staring back at her, pale and gaunt. This time, she noticed something new. Her reflection wasn't just still, it was shifting, as if it were beginning to move without her permission. Her hand, once still, raised of its own accord. She watched in horror as her reflection mimicked her every move, yet her own hand was frozen in place. And then, as if it had a mind of its own, the reflection began to smile. Slowly. Not a real smile, but one of recognition, of something far more sinister. The room around her seemed to darken, the air turning cold. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The reflection's smile stretched wider, a grotesque imitation of her own, and Claire felt a shiver of dread crawl up her spine. The reflection's lips moved. "Do you remember?" it whispered, the words barely audible, a faint echo of a distant memory. The room seemed to tilt, like the walls were closing in, and Claire stumbled back, the mirror becoming a black hole, pulling at her. The words seemed to reverberate in her mind, echoing, lingering in her thoughts. For days after that moment, Claire couldn't bring herself to approach the mirror. It had become an unsettling presence in her home, and yet it was always there, lurking in the corner of her bedroom. At times, she would catch herself glancing at it from the corner of her eye, but when she turned to face it directly, nothing seemed amiss. But there was something else that had begun to disturb her, the dreams. Night after night, they were the same. A woman, someone she didn't recognize, stood at the edge of a darkened hallway, her back to Claire. In the dream, Claire would walk toward her, but the woman would always vanish before Claire could reach her. The woman was always dressed in an old-fashioned gown, dark and tattered, with her face hidden in shadow. But Claire could feel her eyes watching her, always watching. Her presence in the dream was suffocating, oppressive. It felt like a memory she should have known but couldn't remember. One night, Claire woke up in a cold sweat. The dream had been more vivid than ever before, and when she opened her eyes, she saw the shadow standing at the foot of her bed, just outside the reach of the dim light from her bedside lamp. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same figure from her dreams. She blinked, and the shadow was gone. Her heart was racing in her chest as she scanned the room, but there was no one there. Her mind raced. Could it have been real? Had she been seeing things? Was she losing her sanity? But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her mind. Something was happening. Something darker than she could understand. The mirror was pulling her deeper into its grip, and it wasn't letting go. That morning, Claire couldn't resist any longer. She had to know what was happening. She had to confront it, whatever it was. She walked to the mirror, her reflection watching her with those cold, lifeless eyes. The moment she stepped closer, the whispers began again, faint and distant, like an old memory she couldn't quite recall. But this time, there was something else, a figure, standing behind her reflection. She spun around, heart in her throat, but once again, the room was empty. Her pulse quickened as she returned her gaze to the mirror. This time, there was no smiling reflection, no strange whispering, just her staring back at herself. But as she stared deeper into the glass, she noticed something unsettling. The woman from her dreams, the one in the dark gown, was standing behind her in the reflection, just beyond her shoulder. Her face was now visible, pale and hollow, with empty eyes that seemed to pierce Claire's very soul. The figure's lips moved slowly, forming a word Claire couldn't hear. And then, as if in response, Claire's reflection, the one that had always been hers, shifted again. It smiled. It wasn't her smile. It wasn't her. The reflection's mouth opened wide, the smile stretching unnaturally across its face. "Do you remember now?" the figure in the mirror whispered. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she stood frozen in front of the mirror, the reflection's unnatural smile slowly spreading, twisting in a way that no human face ever could. The woman from her dreams, her real face now unmistakable, with hollow eyes and a gaunt expression, stood behind her reflection, as though reaching out from the depths of time itself. "Do you remember now?" the figure whispered again, her voice like the rustle of old paper, faint and yet so clear in Claire's mind. Claire's knees buckled beneath her. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hands trembled, reaching out for something to steady herself. The room around her seemed to blur, the walls closing in. She grabbed the edge of her nightstand, trying to ground herself in the familiar reality she still clung to. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers anymore. It was something else, something that had taken over her face, her identity. The smiling, distorted figure in the glass didn't belong to her. And yet, as Claire looked into the mirror, she couldn't tear her gaze away. The figure's eyes were now full of something deep, something old and ancient, and they seemed to hold a memory that Claire should have known, but couldn't place. Her reflection began to speak again, its voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the silence like a blade. "You don't remember, do you?" The figure smiled wider, showing teeth that looked too sharp, too jagged. Claire tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't obey. She stood paralyzed, her mind racing. What was happening to her? To the mirror? Was she losing her mind? The moment passed, and Claire stumbled away from the mirror, her chest heaving as if she couldn't draw in enough air. She felt the cold air bite at her skin, even though the room was warm. The mirror's surface shimmered slightly, like it was waiting for her return. Her mind spun with questions. The woman, who was she? The memories she had uncovered, or rather, the whispers the mirror had unearthed, felt like fragments of a broken puzzle. They didn't quite fit together. And then it hit her, her grandmother. The woman in the reflection. The face was so familiar, yet so foreign. Claire had seen it before, years ago. She had been a child then, spending summers in the old family house. Her grandmother had kept a portrait of a woman on the wall of her study. The portrait was of a woman dressed in an old-fashioned gown, with hollow eyes, just like the figure in the mirror. Claire remembered it clearly now. She'd always been told it was a distant relative, someone long forgotten. Had that woman been her ancestor? Was the mirror somehow tied to her? The thought was chilling, and yet Claire couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to it. The truth was just out of reach, hiding in the dark corners of her mind. She needed answers. She needed to understand what the mirror had been trying to show her. Later that night, Claire found herself standing in front of the mirror again, this time with a resolve she hadn't felt before. She needed to know, no matter how terrifying it might be. As she gazed into the glass, the reflection stared back at her, empty and still. But the woman, her grandmother, or the figure she now recognized as the source of the whispers, was no longer there. Claire exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. And then, as she turned to leave, the whisper came again. This time, louder, clearer, as if the figure was right behind her. "Remember," it breathed. Claire's pulse quickened. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned back to the mirror, her heart thumping in her chest. She wasn't sure what she expected, but what she saw next was more horrifying than anything she had ever imagined. The reflection shifted again, and Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. The woman, her grandmother, was standing there in the glass, but she was no longer alone. Another figure had appeared beside her, a man. The man was dressed in an old military uniform, the kind worn during World War I, with dark, haunting eyes that seemed to bore into Claire's very soul. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had seen him before, somewhere in the house. But where? And why did he seem so familiar? Claire's throat went dry. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "What do you want from me?" But the reflection didn't answer. Instead, it began to change. The man's face contorted, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone. The woman's lips twisted into a grim smile, and she spoke again, louder this time, her voice rasping, as if coming from deep within a grave. "Find the truth before it's too late." Claire's heart raced in her chest, and she stepped back from the mirror, her mind struggling to piece together the fragments of what she had just witnessed. The woman, the man, had been tied to the mirror in some way, but how? Why was it showing her these disturbing visions? The voice of her grandmother echoed in her head, calling her to uncover the truth. She needed to find out what had happened. She needed to discover what had been hidden in her family's past. Her thoughts returned to the house, to the old family estate that had been passed down through generations. The portraits, the old photographs. Everything in the house seemed to hold memories, secrets. Perhaps the answers she sought lay there, buried in the dust-covered corners of that old mansion. With a heavy heart and a sense of dread creeping over her, Claire made up her mind. She would go back to the family house. She would confront whatever dark history lingered in its walls. The mirror had given her a glimpse of something horrific, and she could no longer ignore it. But as she turned to leave, the reflection in the mirror changed once more. This time, the woman's face twisted into an expression of despair, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice a rasping, desperate plea. "It's not what you think." Claire froze in place, her hand gripping the doorknob as the words sank in. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pull herself away from the mirror's grasp. The reflection's words echoed in her mind, a chilling warning that she couldn't ignore. Claire's journey back to her family's estate was fraught with dread. The drive, which should have been a short trip, stretched on as every mile brought her closer to the place that had haunted her mind for days. The air around her felt heavy, thick with an unsettling weight she couldn't shake. The whispers from the mirror still echoed in her thoughts, growing louder and more desperate with each passing minute. As she drove, the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the winding road. Claire could feel the darkness creeping in, and with it, the unease that had plagued her since the moment the mirror first revealed its secrets. What had her grandmother meant when she warned her not to go? And the man, who was he, really? Was he a ghost? A memory? Or something far worse? Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The house loomed ahead, the silhouette of the old mansion rising from the trees like some ancient, forgotten beast waiting to pounce. The once pristine grounds were now overrun with vines, the once elegant columns now chipped and weathered by time. Claire's stomach churned as she parked in front of the front steps. The house looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, yet she knew it had only been a few months since her last visit. The windows, dark and cold, seemed to stare back at her, as though daring her to enter. Inside, the house smelled like dust and decay. The familiar scent of aged wood and mothballs filled the air, but there was something else, a stale, almost fetid odor that made Claire's stomach turn. She stood still for a moment, her senses heightening as she listened to the silence. The house felt alive, as if the walls were watching her every move. She walked cautiously through the grand foyer, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The paintings that lined the walls seemed to leer at her, their eyes following her with unsettling intensity. Each step felt like a deliberate choice, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet as though the house itself was protesting her presence. Finally, Claire reached the study where the portraits of her ancestors hung. Her grandmother's portrait was at the center of the room, a constant reminder of the past. But now, it felt different. The air around it was charged with an unseen energy, something dark and ancient. Claire hesitated for a moment before reaching out to touch the frame. The wood felt cold to the touch, and for a split second, she felt the unmistakable sensation of something watching her from behind the painting. She turned her attention to the mirror that stood across the room. The same mirror that had plagued her every waking moment since it first whispered her name. Its surface seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow, and for the briefest moment, Claire thought she saw something move within its depths, an old, familiar face, peering out from the shadows. Her heart raced as she crossed the room, her hand shaking as she reached for the edge of the mirror. The reflection was distorted, as if something had warped it, and Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what was happening, what had happened. Her fingers grazed the glass, and in that instant, the world around her shifted. The room seemed to tilt, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and Claire stumbled back, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She had never felt anything like this before. The mirror was alive, its power seeping into the room, into her very bones. But before she could react, the glass shimmered once again, and the image of the woman, her grandmother, appeared before her. This time, there was no smile, no cryptic whispers. The reflection was simply watching her, its hollow eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. Claire stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the cold surface of the mirror. As her fingers made contact, a rush of images flooded her mind, scenes she had long forgotten, memories locked away deep in her subconscious. She saw herself as a child, running through the old mansion's halls, laughing as she played hide-and-seek with her grandmother. But the laughter was hollow, echoing in the empty rooms like the sound of a distant, forgotten joy. The image shifted, and she saw herself as a teenager, arguing with her parents in this very room. The words were harsh, but the love was still there, thick in the air. And then, the images darkened. The last memory struck Claire like a thunderclap. The reflection of herself, older, more fearful, stood at the foot of a spiral staircase in the mansion's deepest, most forgotten wing. The door at the bottom of the stairs was half open, and Claire could see the faintest flicker of light from within. The woman in the mirror began to speak, her voice no longer a whisper, but a loud, commanding presence that filled Claire's ears. You were always meant to remember. You were always meant to find the truth. The words made Claire's blood run cold. The truth about what? Without thinking, Claire crossed the room to the staircase. She had to see what was behind that door. She had to know what had been hidden from her for so long. The stairs creaked beneath her as she descended, her heart pounding in her chest. The air in the basement was thick with dust and the scent of something ancient. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached the door, her hand trembling on the knob. As she pushed it open, the dim light revealed what had been concealed for so many years, an old, decrepit room filled with piles of forgotten journals, photographs, and letters. And in the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror. But it was not just any mirror. It was the same one from her grandmother's study, the one that had been whispering to her, showing her the forgotten past. But now, the mirror was different. It had a presence, an energy that seemed to radiate from its depths, pulling her closer, drawing her in. And as she stared into its surface, she saw something that sent a chill down her spine, her own face, reflected back at her, but distorted, as if twisted by the hands of time itself. She watched as her reflection began to move, its lips curling into a smile. It knew everything. Claire stood before the mirror, her reflection locked in its eerie, hypnotic gaze. The whispers had stopped. The room was silent, save for her own labored breathing. And then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the mirror spoke. Remember, Claire, you cannot run from the truth. It is already in you. A cold wave of realization washed over Claire. The mirror had been a vessel, a keeper of memories long buried, memories of her own life, her own family's dark past. And now, she understood. The mirror had shown her what she had always known. Deep down inside, the truth was never lost. It had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. With a trembling hand, Claire reached out once more, touching the surface of the mirror. The glass shimmered as the reflection twisted and shifted, and for a brief moment, she saw it clearly, her own face, older, but with the same hollow eyes as the woman in the portrait. The mirror remembered everything. And so did she. The truth had finally been unveiled. Story 6. Gregory Cole had always been a creature of habit. At 34, he had a routine so precise it bordered on obsession. He woke at 6 a.m. each day, drank his black coffee with 2 sugars, left his apartment at precisely 7:30, and arrived at the office by 8 o'clock. His life, despite its sterile predictability, was simple, and for Gregory, that was enough. He didn't mind the quiet, the monotony, or the solitude. But that was before the phone call. It had been a Friday night, the kind of night where the weight of the week settled in his bones, and he felt the soothing embrace of silence. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of his TV, where some random documentary droned on about an obscure historical event. He had his feet propped up on the coffee table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in hand. His mind was dull, ready to shut down for the night. But then, the phone rang. It wasn't unusual for Gregory to get late-night calls. His friends sometimes had too much to drink, and the odd family member, scattered across the country, would check in at odd hours. But this time, when he glanced at the screen, his heart skipped. It was his own number. The same digits he had memorized for years. For a brief moment, he considered ignoring the call. His thumb hovered over the decline button, but something in his gut pulled him toward answering. An inexplicable, almost magnetic compulsion. Hello? His voice was steady, but his heartbeat was louder than it should have been. The voice on the other end was his own, but strained, distorted, as though someone was imitating him, only worse. Gregory, you need to run. They're coming for you. They're already inside. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He felt the sudden rush of heat, a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. For a moment, he thought it was a prank, some sick joke from a friend who had hacked his number. But there was something about the voice that didn't sit right. It was his, but not his. The panic was unmistakable, as if he had been dragged through some nightmare he couldn't escape. Who is this? Gregory demanded, his mind racing. The voice on the other end didn't answer immediately, and he heard a muffled sound, like static or something more insidious. The call cut off abruptly. For a long time, Gregory stood there in silence, staring at the phone. The cold sweat had turned to goosebumps, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the call was more than just a prank. There was an unease in the air, a sense of something crawling just beneath the surface, waiting to break free. He thought about calling back, but the fear that crept into his chest stopped him. It wasn't just fear of the call, it was the fear of something more abstract, something deeper. The next morning, Gregory tried to shake the eerie feeling, telling himself it was just a fluke. A glitch in the system. Maybe some strange coincidence where his own number had somehow shown up on his phone. But as the day wore on, the unease continued to gnaw at him. The voice, that sense of panic, lingered in his thoughts. He tried to distract himself with work, but everything felt hollow, like a thin layer of paint over something much darker. The memory of the call stuck with him. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized something that chilled him to his core. He had never said the words that were spoken to him last night. They're coming for you. They're already inside. He had never uttered those words. But somehow, it felt like a warning that was only meant for him. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, trying to focus. But his phone kept vibrating. He checked it and found a message from his sister, Emma. She had sent him a simple text, "Call me when you get the chance. It's important." Gregory didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat there, the phone in his hand, a lump of dread lodged in his throat. He wasn't sure why, but he felt that calling Emma would only lead to more confusion. The message was innocuous enough, but it was just another thing to pile onto his growing unease. Gregory spent the next few days trying to continue with his life. He met friends for dinner, went to work, watched mindless television. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just outside his peripheral vision, never fully left. Each time his phone rang, he half expected it to be the same distorted voice from the night before. And then, it happened again. It was a Thursday night this time. He was in his apartment, scrolling through social media, when the phone rang. This time, the number wasn't his own. It was an unknown number, but he recognized the area code, his hometown. Without thinking, Gregory answered. Gregory, the voice on the other end was calm, but it still carried that same distorted quality. "They found you. You need to leave. It's already started." The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It was the same voice from before. His voice. The panic, the dread, he could hear it clearly. And then, the call dropped. No warning, no explanation. Just the eerie silence that followed. Gregory stared at the phone, his hands trembling. His mind raced with questions. Was he going crazy? Was this some sort of psychological break? But the voice, his voice, was too real, too raw. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone in his apartment. Not in his mind, not in his thoughts. Gregory's life began to unravel. The unsettling phone calls kept coming. Each time, they were the same, a distorted version of his voice warning him to run, to leave, to escape. He tried calling his family, but no one seemed to have any answers. Emma, his sister, had no idea why he was receiving these calls, and when he told her about the voice, she laughed nervously, trying to convince him it was a prank. But Gregory didn't believe her. He couldn't. Something was happening, something that he didn't understand. And the worst part? He didn't know where it was coming from. Who was doing this to him? And why? One night, as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, watching the shadows move across the walls, the phone rang again. He didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. His own number. His throat went dry as he answered. Gregory. The voice was frantic now, the words almost incoherent. They're here. They're inside your apartment. You need to leave. Now. Don't look. Don't look. Gregory's heart pounded in his chest, and he immediately stood, rushing to the door, his mind swimming with terror. But as he reached for the doorknob, he froze. Something was wrong. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. He slowly turned, glancing toward the corner of the room where the light from the lamp flickered erratically. The shadows moved. Gregory's breath hitched in his chest as he backed away from the door. The shadows, it wasn't his imagination. He could see them moving, shifting, as if they were alive. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. The phone call from himself echoed in his mind, "Don't look. Don't look." But it was too late. His gaze locked onto the corner where the shadows danced, and with a sickening realization, he saw what they were, figures. Dark, human-like shapes that didn't belong. He could see their features, twisted and contorted, as though they were copies of himself, each one resembling a darker, more twisted version of Gregory. A voice broke through his panic. It wasn't the voice on the phone, it was his own voice, but different, distorted, dripping with malice. Run, Gregory. Run while you still can. The phone slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. As the shadows moved closer, Gregory's mind began to fracture. The realization hit him like a freight train. The voices, the shadows, the warnings, it wasn't just a prank. It was something far worse. He wasn't running from someone. He was running from himself. The next morning, Gregory woke to the sound of his phone ringing. The relentless chime dragged him from a restless sleep, his body soaked in sweat, his mind clouded with fragments of nightmares. As he reached for the phone, his hand trembled uncontrollably. He hesitated, staring at the screen. It was his number again. This time, the sense of dread that washed over him wasn't fleeting. It was a suffocating weight on his chest, like the very air around him had thickened with terror. He took a deep breath and answered the call. Gregory, the voice came through the line, as panicked as it had been the previous nights. You don't understand. You're not safe. They're already inside. They've taken everything. You can't trust anyone, especially yourself. Don't look at the mirror. The words sent a shock of cold through Gregory's veins. He almost dropped the phone, the blood draining from his face. His own voice, desperate, urgent, yet distorted beyond recognition, cut through him like a knife. Don't look at the mirror. The line went dead. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, too shocked to move. It was happening again, the same morning, the same panic. It felt more real this time, though, as if whatever was happening was closing on him, getting closer by the second. He had to leave. He had to get out of the apartment, out of his head. He stood up, but as he walked toward the door, his eyes flickered to the hallway mirror, a familiar fixture that had always hung on the wall just outside the living room. For some inexplicable reason, his feet froze. "Don't look at the mirror." The words echoed through his mind like a warning bell, sending a spike of terror through his gut. Gregory had never been superstitious. But this felt different. His eyes remained locked on the mirror for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then, as if under the sway of some invisible force, he began to walk toward it. He felt his breath quicken as he neared, a suffocating sense of dread filling his chest with each step. The mirror was just a mirror, wasn't it? Nothing more than a reflection of the room behind him. Nothing more than glass and silver edges. That's what he tried to convince himself as his hand reached for the edge of the frame. But as soon as his fingers brushed the cold glass, he froze. In the reflection, he didn't see himself alone. Behind him, standing just a few feet away, was someone else. It was a darker, twisted version of himself, its features contorted in a grotesque grin, eyes wide and bloodshot. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring. A sickening chill ran down his spine as he recoiled from the glass, his breath hitching in his throat. It was just a trick. A trick of the light. A trick of the mind. But Gregory couldn't tear his eyes away from the reflection. The figure behind him, his reflection, continued to stare. And as he watched, the figure's lips began to move. He couldn't hear any sound, but he knew the words, as if they were written in his mind. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice wasn't his own. It wasn't his voice at all. Gregory stumbled backward, his pulse racing. His body was trembling, his head dizzy from the sheer terror that gripped him. His eyes were wide, searching the room behind him as if expecting to find something, a clue, an answer, but the room was still. Silent. Normal. The reflection, however, was not. The figure grinned wider now, a sick, mocking smile that stretched impossibly far across its face. He could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze as if it was reaching out to him. He needed to leave. He had to get away. But his legs wouldn't obey. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw something even more terrifying. The figure in the mirror, the one that wasn't him, raised its hand, pointing at him. Gregory's heart stuttered in his chest. The reflection's lips moved again. "Run, Gregory. Run. You can't hide from yourself." Gregory stumbled back further, his body crashing into the living room table, knocking over his glass of whiskey. He didn't notice. His mind was spinning, a whirl of panic and disbelief. He could still hear the voice of the reflection, now laughing softly, menacingly, from within the mirror. His thoughts twisted into a chaotic mess. He wanted to flee, to leave this apartment, to escape the terror that was closing in on him. But there was no escape. He couldn't outrun what was happening to him. It was as if the very fabric of his reality had started to unravel, thread by thread. The line between what was real and what was not was blurring, fading, and he was trapped somewhere in the middle of it all. "Run, Gregory. Run from yourself." The words echoed through his mind over and over again, growing louder, more frantic with every repetition. He stumbled toward the door, his mind desperately trying to break free from the horrors playing out inside his head. His fingers fumbled for the doorknob, but as his hand grasped the cold metal, he felt something else. presence. A weight. It was as if something was standing just behind him, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. His breath came in shallow gasps as he turned around, half expecting the twisted figure from the mirror to be standing there in the doorway. But when he looked, there was nothing. Only the empty apartment, still and silent. Yet, the sense of being watched, of something lurking just behind him, remained. The phone in his pocket buzzed again, a jarring, sharp sound that sent his heart leaping into his throat. He pulled it out, hand shaking, and checked the screen. It was his number. Again. Gregory's blood ran cold. The voice on the other end wasn't panicked this time. It wasn't urgent. It was calm. You can't escape this. You never will. We're already inside, Gregory. We've always been inside. Gregory slammed the phone onto the floor in sheer terror. It skittered across the room, but he didn't care. His mind was unraveling. The reality he knew, the life he had lived, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. The reflection, the twisted versions of himself, the phone calls, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. There was no escape. His breath was ragged now, his pulse pounding in his ears. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in on him, and he backed himself into the corner of the room, trying to make sense of the madness that was suffocating him. He had to leave. He had to find out what was happening. But he didn't know where to go. And then, as if in response to his thoughts, a voice, his own, whispered from the corner of the room. Run, Gregory. Run before it's too late. He turned, his body frozen in fear, his gaze falling on the reflection in the mirror. It was back again, standing behind him, its twisted smile mocking him. But this time, the reflection did something even more horrifying. It stepped forward, out of the mirror, into the real world. Gregory's breath caught in his throat as the dark version of himself reached toward him. Gregory's heart pounded in his chest as his mind reeled. The reflection, the twisted version of himself, stepped out of the mirror, its distorted face twisted into an unnerving grin. It was no longer confined to the glass. It was here, in the room with him, taking form, becoming real. Gregory stumbled back, his feet tangling with the rug beneath him, falling hard against the floor. He scrambled to stand, his legs uncooperative, shaking violently with panic. The figure, a grotesque caricature of himself, towered above him, its eyes wide with hunger, a malevolent energy pulsing from its every movement. It was so wrong, so deeply unsettling that Gregory couldn't even comprehend it. The figure reached out a hand, long and bony, fingers extending with an eerie, unnatural slowness. His breath hitched. This isn't real. It can't be real. But as the figure moved closer, every sense in his body screamed in terror. His mind raced. What was happening to him? What had been happening all along? He thought back to the mirror that had started it all, the reflection that no longer behaved as it should. His own face twisted into a cruel parody, a dark, evil version of himself. It wasn't just the mirror that had changed. He had changed. And now, something was after him. Something far worse than he could ever have imagined. The twisted reflection took another step forward, its eyes locking with Gregory's, a mocking glint flickering within them. Gregory's thoughts swirled. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" he croaked, his voice shaky with fear. The figure's lips curled into a grin that stretched unnaturally wide, almost as if its face was trying to split open. It didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, and Gregory's mind screamed, "No! I have to get out of here." Gregory's body reacted before his brain could fully process what was happening. He darted toward the door, his fingers fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though the apartment itself had turned against him, the very walls closing in, trapping him in this nightmare. He could hear the footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, the sound of heavy breathing filling the air. It was too much. His chest felt tight, as if the air was growing thicker, heavier. He turned, desperately clawing at the door once more. Through the haze of panic, his eyes caught sight of the mirror again. His reflection, his true reflection, was still there. But now, instead of staring at him with an eerie calm, it was reaching through the glass, its fingers scraping against the surface as though trying to pull itself through. And behind it, the distorted version of himself stood motionless, watching him with a cruel, unblinking stare. Gregory's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a trick of the mind, it wasn't just the mirror playing games with him. This was something else, something deeper, more sinister. Something wanted him. He turned away from the door, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions, all unanswered. The reflection, the figure, it was all connected. But how? And why had this been happening to him? His thoughts spiraled into chaos, and then, suddenly, the air in the room grew cold. A voice, his own voice, spoke from the depths of his memory, echoing through his mind like a haunting whisper. "You don't remember, do you?" Gregory froze. "What do you mean?" The voice continued, calm but unmistakably cold. "You don't remember what happened. The things you've done. The things you've hidden from yourself." He staggered back, the cold feeling in his chest spreading outward. His eyes widened. No, this can't be real. It can't. Gregory's mind snapped back to a long-forgotten memory, a time before all of this began, a place buried deep in his past. He remembered his childhood home, the small house tucked away on the edge of town. His mother, father, his brother. All of it seemed like a distant dream now, but the fragments, the flashes of memory, began to fit together in ways that terrified him. In his childhood, he had a strange obsession with mirrors. He would stare into them for hours, fascinated by his own reflection, as if trying to find something deeper, something hidden just beneath the surface. His parents had always warned him about it, telling him to stop staring into the glass, to stop trying to look into things that weren't meant to be seen. But Gregory had ignored their warnings. He remembered the day it all changed. The day he saw something else in the reflection, a shadow that wasn't his own, a face staring back at him from beyond the glass. That face had smiled at him, a wicked, knowing smile that sent chills through his young body. Now, standing in this room, a grown man trapped by his own reflection, he realized with horror that he had never truly left that moment behind. The face in the mirror, the twisted version of himself, it had always been there. And it wasn't just watching. It had been waiting for him to remember. The voice from the mirror, the voice of his past, spoke again, this time louder, clearer. You open the door, Gregory. Now you have to face what's behind it. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shifted. The figure behind him grinned even wider, its twisted lips parting in a jagged smile. Gregory's heart skipped a beat as he turned slowly, staring into the glass once again. This time, the reflection was different. It was not just his twisted counterpart, it was something more. Something ancient. The glass shimmered, and for a brief moment, Gregory could see past the reflection itself. He could see a vast, dark expanse filled with shadows and shapes that moved, shifting and undulating like a living nightmare. He couldn't look away. His eyes were locked on the glass, drawn to it as if it was pulling him in, deeper and deeper into the abyss. His mind screamed for him to stop, to look away, but his body betrayed him. The longer he stared, the more the shadows seemed to grow, reaching toward him, pulling at his soul. This wasn't just about a reflection. This wasn't just a curse on a mirror. This was something much older, much darker. Gregory's skin crawled with the realization. The mirror, his reflection, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a doorway. A gateway. And now that he had looked, now that he had remembered, there was no going back. His body trembled as he staggered back from the mirror, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls bending and twisting in a sickening dance. The figure in the glass grinned wider, its eyes glinting with malice. Gregory's breath came in short, frantic bursts. The reflection's voice echoed in his mind, repeating the same words over and over. You open the door, Gregory. You have to face it now. The shadows seemed to lurch forward, reaching out from the mirror and crawling toward him. He tried to turn, tried to flee, but his feet were frozen, rooted to the floor. The terror in his chest was suffocating, crushing him. He was trapped. Trapped in this room, trapped in this nightmare. And the mirror that had once been a mere reflection, was now the only thing that stood between him and whatever was waiting for him on the other side. Gregory's mind was a fog of panic, dread, and confusion as he stared into the mirror. The room around him had ceased to exist. All that remained was the glass, the reflection, and the growing shadows that had once been confined to the other side, now creeping closer and closer like a predatory fog. The air in the room had turned frigid, the temperature plummeting as though the very essence of the room was being siphoned away, drawn into the glass. Gregory's breath came in rapid, shallow gasps, his body frozen, rooted to the floor by an invisible force. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear his eyes away, but he couldn't. He couldn't. The figure in the reflection, his reflection, smiled with an almost loving cruelty. Its lips pulled back in a sinister grin, and for the first time, it spoke to him, a voice not just an echo in his mind, but a real, physical presence that reverberated in the room like an ancient chant. You should have never opened it, Gregory. You never should have looked. The words reverberated through his chest, vibrating his very bones. The shadowy mass beyond the reflection twisted and shifted, like a living thing with a mind of its own. It was reaching for him, its fingers long and spindly, stretching toward him through the glass, inch by agonizing inch. Gregory's knees buckled beneath him. His chest ached, his heart slamming against his ribcage. The room was closing on him, he could feel it. There was no escape. His reflection, that terrible, twisted version of himself, stepped closer in the glass. It grinned wider, its eyes gleaming with something darker, something far older than any human emotion. "You were always mine, Gregory," the reflection cooed, its voice echoing through the room like the whispers of long-forgotten souls. "This was never a choice. You just didn't remember." A sudden burst of understanding exploded in his mind. He remembered, or at least felt something deep within himself, something he had buried away long ago, something darker than the reflection staring back at him. "I opened the door. I let it in." A scream, raw and desperate, ripped from Gregory's throat. He stumbled back, his hands clawing at the walls behind him, desperate to create some kind of distance. He didn't know if he could escape, but he had to try. There had to be a way out. His mind raced. His reflection, the thing in the mirror, was part of him. It wasn't some demon or malevolent spirit. It wasn't some foreign entity from beyond the glass. It was him. His dark side. His forgotten self. That shadowy part of his past that he had suppressed, locked away, a part of himself that had always been there, waiting to be remembered. But it wasn't just a shadow. It was alive, and it wanted him. It had always wanted him. Gregory's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, the coldness of the room pressing against him. The thing in the mirror, the reflection that had twisted into something monstrous, was still there, still smiling, still watching, still waiting. "Why do you fight it, Gregory?" the reflection taunted, its voice now thick with amusement. "You can't run from yourself. Not anymore." The room began to blur around him. The reflection's grin stretched impossibly wide, consuming the glass, the space between them, until Gregory could see nothing but that twisted, malevolent face. And then, as if responding to his thoughts, a searing pain shot through his chest. It wasn't physical. It was worse. It was a deep, existential ache, a feeling of something essential being torn from him, unraveling in ways he couldn't understand. The mirror began to vibrate, its surface rippling like water, as though something from within was trying to break free. The shadows in the reflection thickened, solidified, and grew. The figure, no longer contained by the glass, began to stretch forward, its arms reaching out through the surface. It wasn't a mirror anymore, it was a portal. A doorway to somewhere darker. Somewhere far worse. Gregory's heart slammed in his chest. He reached for the mirror, his fingers trembling. If he could just touch it, if he could just break the cycle, maybe. The figure in the reflection smiled wider, and then, with terrifying suddenness, it lunged. Gregory's scream was swallowed up by the glass as the figure surged toward him, its hands clasping around his throat. The glass itself dissolved into a mass of shadows, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket, pulling him into the depths of its darkness. His vision blurred, distorted by the thick, choking mists of the mirror's world, and for a moment he thought he might die there, trapped in the darkness forever. But then, in a final moment of clarity, something broke through. A sliver of light, faint but undeniable, pierced the fog. Gregory felt himself pulled toward it, his body slipping and sliding against the weight of the shadow, until it released him. With a violent shudder, Gregory was flung backward, crashing into the floor with a force that left his body gasping for breath. The mirror, now shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments, lay before him. The twisted reflection was gone, and in its place, there was nothing. Just silence. The room was still. The temperature was normal again. The air didn't feel thick anymore. But Gregory knew. He knew deep down that it was only an illusion. The reflection wasn't gone. It was still there, watching him from the broken pieces of the mirror, waiting. He couldn't escape it. Days passed. Gregory continued with his life, going through the motions, trying to ignore the feeling that clung to him. The whispers, the strange sensations, the feeling of being watched. He tried to move on, but the truth haunted him, lurking in the back of his mind. The fragments of the mirror had been cleaned up, the glass disposed of. But the reflection, his reflection, it still lingered in his mind, in the corner of his vision. It was never far away. And then, one day, it happened. His phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but there was something too familiar about it. He answered. His voice cracked, the same voice that had haunted him for weeks. His heart raced in his chest. And then, on the other end, came a voice. His voice. Panicked, desperate. Run, Gregory. Run now. It's not over. It's never over. The line went dead. Gregory stared at the phone in his hand, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The voice, his voice, had spoken to him once again. It wasn't over. It wasn't over. As he looked out the window, the shadows outside grew longer, stretching toward him like fingers from beyond the glass. The reflection was out there, watching, waiting. And the worst part? He couldn't remember the last time he felt truly alone. It had always been with him. Always. The mirror had never been broken. And now, neither was Gregory.